Something built these stones. Something moved them, shaped them, aligned them to the sky with precision we still can't replicate. No cranes, no written records, no explanation that holds up. Just silence and impossible answers buried in rock. Archaeologists call them anomalies. Historians call them mistakes in the timeline. We call them evidence. For the next 3 hours, we're breaking down the discoveries that shouldn't exist. Lost cities, vanished technologies, blueprints older than civilization itself. No filler, no fluff. Just the facts, the theories, and the questions nobody's answered yet. Let's get into it. In the southern reaches of Siberia, where the taiga thickens and the Shoria mountains rise in quiet, forested folds, there sits a wall. Not a wall of logs or mortared stone, but of granite, massive blocks, some estimated to weigh over 1,000 tons, stacked with edges so clean they seem machined rather than quarried. Moss creeps across their faces. Trees have rooted in the gaps between them, and yet the joints remain tight, almost seamless, as if time itself has been reluctant to pry them apart. Local guides call the site simply the Wall, part of a larger formation scattered across the Gornaya Shoria region. Geologists who have examined the outcrops offer a straightforward account. This is likely a natural rock formation, shaped over millennia by tectonic stress, fracturing, and erosion along the granite's natural fault lines. Stone, they explain, can break in surprisingly regular patterns, especially granite, which often splits along planes of weakness formed deep within the Earth's crust. By this reading, nature alone is the sculptor, and human imagination has simply filled in the rest. But stand before the blocks, and the question resists easy closure. Some of the stones show right angles sharp enough to unsettle the eye. Corners meet corners with a regularity that natural fracturing, however precise, doesn't always produce. There are no tool marks, no chisel scars, nothing that would obviously mark human hands at work, and yet the absence of evidence has, for some, become its own kind of evidence. If people did shape this place, they left no trace of how. This is where the mainstream account begins to share space with something more speculative. A number of researchers and enthusiasts, outside formal geology, have proposed that the wall isn't natural at all, but the remnant of construction far older than recorded history in the region. Some point to the sheer mass of the blocks and ask how, without cranes or metal tools, anyone could have moved or shaped them. Others go further, suggesting the site may hint at a lost period of advanced building knowledge, long since erased by time, climate, or catastrophe. None of these theories carry the weight of peer-reviewed confirmation, but none have been definitively closed off either. It's worth remembering that Siberia holds no shortage of geological oddities. Basalt columns, granite tors, and naturally stacked boulder fields exist across the region, some of them formed through processes scientists understand well. Skeptics argue that Gornaya Shoria is simply an especially striking example, dramatic to look at, but explainable through ordinary forces given enough time. And it's true that the human eye is drawn to patterns, sometimes seeing intention where there is only coincidence. And yet, those who have visited describe a stillness at the site that's difficult to put into words, a sense of standing before something whose story hasn't been fully told. No excavation has settled the matter, no definitive study has closed the case. The wall simply stands, indifferent to the debate surrounding it, holding its shape against the slow erosion of centuries. Perhaps it is nothing more than stone behaving as stone does, or perhaps it is a fragment of something we no longer have the context to recognize, a structure whose builders, methods, and purpose have slipped entirely out of memory. The forest keeps growing around it. The moss keeps spreading. and the granite, block by silent block, keeps its answers to itself. The wall in Gornaya Shoria keeps its silence in a forest few outsiders ever see. But 4,000 kilometers to the southeast, on the arid Loess Plateau of northern China, another silence was broken only recently, and what it revealed may be just as difficult to explain. For decades, the hills of Shenmu County in China's Shanxi province looked like nothing more than eroded terrain, dry, wind-carved slopes typical of the Loess Plateau. Local farmers had long known of scattered jade artifacts turning up in the soil, but few suspected what lay beneath. Then, beginning in earnest around 2011, archaeologists uncovered something that rewrote assumptions about early Chinese civilization. A walled city, roughly 400 hectares in size, built around a stepped stone pyramid rising more than 70 meters, a structure now known as Shimao. To put that in perspective, at its base, Shimao's pyramid is comparable in footprint to some of the largest structures of the ancient world. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at around 2300 BC, meaning it predates the earliest Chinese dynasties recorded in traditional histories. This wasn't a minor settlement. Shimao appears to have been a major regional power, fortified, organized, and occupied for roughly 500 years before being abandoned. Its purpose and its people slipping quietly out of the historical record until the 21st century brought them back into view. The engineering itself raises the first layer of questions. The pyramid wasn't built as a solid mound of packed earth, as many ancient structures were. Instead, its builders used a technique involving stepped stone terraces, retaining walls and rammed earth cores, a method requiring careful planning, structural knowledge, and an enormous coordinated labor force. Excavators have found evidence of internal staircases, palatial structures near the summit, and residential terraces cascading down its stepped sides. Whoever organized this project understood weight distribution, drainage, and the long-term stability of stacked stone under stress. That is not the work of an improvised settlement. It is the work of an established civilization with an engineering tradition. One that, until recently, historians didn't know existed at this scale, this early in this part of the world. Then there are the walls. Stretching for kilometers around the site, Shimao's fortifications were built using stone construction techniques whose sophistication surprised even the archaeologists who found them. And embedded within some of those walls, deliberately placed, not simply lost, were pieces of jade. Blades, chisel-like objects, and ornamental pieces, some sealed directly into the stonework where no one was meant to retrieve them. Why would a civilization embed valuable, finely crafted jade into a defensive wall, invisible and inaccessible once construction was complete? Was it a ritual offering, meant to protect the city spiritually rather than physically, a symbolic act of consecration, or something more difficult to categorize, a practice whose meaning simply hasn't survived? Mainstream archaeology offers reasonable, well-supported explanations for much of this. Ritual deposition, the practice of burying or embedding valuable objects during construction, appears in numerous ancient cultures across the world, from foundation offerings in Mesopotamia to jade burials in later Chinese dynasties. Shimao, in this view, may simply represent an early and unusually elaborate example of practices archaeologists already understand in principle, even if the specific meaning at this site remains unclear. Likewise, the pyramid's engineering, while impressive, fits within a plausible trajectory of Neolithic and early Bronze Age construction knowledge. Evidence not of an anomaly, but of a civilization more advanced than previously credited. And yet, questions remain that even careful excavation hasn't fully answered. Who ruled Shimao? No written records have been found to name its leaders, its laws, or its gods. The city's script, if it had one, has not survived, or has not yet been identified. Was Shimao connected to the dynasties that followed, feeding ideas and techniques into what would later become Chinese civilization? Or did it rise, flourish, and fall largely in isolation, its knowledge dying with its abandonment around 1800 BC? Some researchers have speculated about contact or influence from other Bronze Age cultures further west, pointing to certain stylistic similarities in artifacts. Others caution against reading too much into surface resemblances, noting that similar solutions to similar engineering problems can emerge independently without any contact at all. The evidence, so far, doesn't settle the matter either way. There is also the matter of scale. Shimao was not a village experimenting with new ideas. It was, by all appearances, the center of a complex, hierarchical society, one capable of mobilizing thousands of workers, coordinating long-term construction projects, and maintaining that effort across generations. That kind of organization implies systems of governance, resource management, and labor control that we still don't fully understand. What compelled its people to build so large, so early? What need, political, spiritual, or defensive, demanded a pyramid of stone rising from the Loess Hills? Excavation at Shimao continues. Every season uncovers new terraces, new fragments of wall, new pieces of jade pressed into stone for reasons still unspoken. Each discovery answers a question and raises two more. Perhaps, in time, Shimao's silence will give way to clarity. A script deciphered, a lineage traced, a purpose confirmed. Or perhaps this city will remain what it has been for 38 centuries, a monument to a civilization that built magnificently, vanished quietly, and left behind more stone than story. Shimao rose from Loess Hills that most of the world had forgotten to look at. 2,500 kilometers west, in the desert heat of Abydos, Egypt, another structure sits low in the earth, not rising toward the sky but sunk beneath it, as if deliberately hidden from view. The Osireion lies behind the Temple of Seti the Fern, one of the most revered pharaonic sites in Egypt. Where most ancient Egyptian temples were built to be seen, their pylons and columns reaching upward, catching the sun. The Osireion was built downward, set into a pit below the surrounding water table, its chambers often partially flooded even today. Visitors descending toward it don't look up at grandeur. They look down into shadow, water pooling around massive stone pillars that seem to rise not from a floor, but from the earth itself. Egyptologists generally date the Osireion to the reign of Seti III, around 1279 BC, based on inscriptions found within the structure bearing his name and titles. By this account, it was built as a cenotaph, a symbolic tomb, dedicated to Osiris, god of death and rebirth. Its subterranean design meant to evoke the primordial waters from which Egyptian mythology held that all creation began. It's a reading grounded in a mainstream understanding of Egyptian religious architecture, and one that finds support in the very name inscribed on the walls. And yet, look closer at the stones themselves, and a different kind of question begins to surface. The core structure of the Osireion is built from massive blocks of red granite and sandstone, some weighing many tons, fitted together with a level of precision that has puzzled visitors for over a century. The joints between certain blocks are so tight that inserting even a thin blade between them proves difficult. There is no mortar, no visible gap, just stone meeting stone in near seamless contact, the kind of fit modern masons associate with far more advanced tools than were believed to be available in the New Kingdom period. This precision has led some researchers, including a small number of unconventional Egyptologists, to propose a controversial idea that the core of the Osireion may predate Seti I's reign by a significant margin, potentially by thousands of years, and that the structure was simply restored, inscribed, and reclaimed by Seti's builders long after its original construction. In this view, the granite core represents something older, something whose true age and purpose have been obscured by later additions layered on top of it. Mainstream Egyptology has largely rejected this dating, and for reasons worth taking seriously. The argument for a much older origin relies heavily on stylistic comparison and subjective impressions of the stonework's age, rather than on stratigraphic or material evidence that could independently confirm it. Ground-penetrating techniques and geological analysis of the site have not produced findings that require abandoning the conventional timeline. And the presence of Seti's cartouches throughout the structure, while not conclusive proof of original construction, is difficult to simply set aside. Most Egyptologists maintain that the Osireion's construction, however impressive, falls within the known capabilities of New Kingdom builders, who were, after all, responsible for temples, obelisks, and tombs that continue to astonish observers today without requiring an older, unknown civilization to explain them. Still, certain details resist easy dismissal. Why would a civilization go to such extraordinary lengths, cutting and fitting massive granite blocks with such exacting tolerance, for a structure deliberately built to sit below the water table, half submerged, difficult to access, and largely hidden from public view? Temples built for display tend to showcase their finest work where it can be seen and admired. The Osireion inverts that logic, burying its most impressive stonework in darkness and water. Was this intentional? A symbolic descent into the underworld? Precision as an offering rather than a display? Or does the unusual setting hint at a different original function entirely, one that had nothing to do with Osiris or the mythology later attached to it? There is also the matter of technique. Even granting the conventional dating, the methods used to achieve such tight-fitting joints in granite, one of the hardest stones the Egyptians worked with, remain only partially understood. Egyptologists have proposed various tools and grinding techniques capable of producing this level of precision, and experimental archaeology has demonstrated that ancient methods could, with enormous time and skill, achieve comparable results. But demonstrating that something is possible is not the same as confirming exactly how, when, or by whom it was done at this specific site. The stones don't explain their own history. They simply sit, tightly joined, keeping their process to themselves. Water still seeps into the lower chambers of the Osireion, just as it likely did in antiquity, whether by design or by the simple persistence of a high water table refusing to be excavated away. Scholars continue to debate what the flooding meant to those who built it, whether it was an unwanted intrusion the builders worked around, or a deliberate feature meant to evoke the waters of creation described in Egyptian myth. Perhaps future excavation, or new methods of dating stone rather than inscriptions, will finally settle the question of when this structure first took shape. Or perhaps the Osireion will remain what it has been for thousands of years, a monument standing at the boundary between myth and masonry, its granite silent on the matter of its own beginning. The Osireion holds its water and its silence at the edge of the desert. Nearly 2,000 kilometers northeast, in the volcanic heart of Cappadocia, Turkey, another kind of silence waits, not beneath the standing water, but beneath solid rock, in a city that was never meant to be seen from above at all. Derinkuyu is, by any measure, an extraordinary feat of ancient engineering. Carved directly into soft volcanic tuff, this underground complex descends approximately 85 meters, roughly the height of a 20-story building, through at least 18 levels of tunnels, chambers, stables, chapels, storage rooms, and communal spaces. At its estimated peak capacity, historians believe Derinkuyu could have sheltered somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 people, along with their livestock and food supplies, for extended periods of time. The mainstream historical account is well documented and reasonably solid. Cappadocia's soft volcanic rock made excavation possible with relatively simple tools, and the region's long history of invasion and unrest, from Persian incursions to Arab raids during the Byzantine period, and later Mongol and Ottoman-era conflicts, gave successive populations strong incentive to dig downward rather than build upward. Archaeological evidence suggests the earliest tunnels may date back to the Phrygian period, around the 8th century BC, with the site expanded significantly over centuries, particularly by early Christian communities seeking refuge underground. Massive circular stone doors, some over a meter thick, could be rolled into place from the inside to seal off sections of the complex. Sensible defensive engineering for a people who expected to need it. What continues to draw researchers back to Derinkuyu, however, isn't the scale of its excavation. It's the ventilation. An underground city capable of housing tens of thousands of people for weeks or months at a time faces an immediate, unforgiving problem: air. Torches and cooking fires consume oxygen and produce smoke. Human respiration alone, multiplied across thousands of people packed into confined stone chambers, would quickly render deep levels unbreathable without some means of continuous air exchange. And yet, Derinkuyu's builders solved this problem, not adequately, but remarkably well. More than 15,000 shafts, some extending the entire depth of the complex, connect the lowest levels to the surface, functioning as a network of vertical ventilation channels. Air moves through the structure with enough efficiency that even the deepest chambers remained livable. This is where the questions begin to accumulate. Designing a single shaft to bring air from the surface to a shallow room is a manageable engineering problem. Designing a coordinated system of thousands of shafts at varying depths and angles that maintains breathable air across 18 interconnected levels, without modern tools for measuring airflow, pressure, or gas concentration, is something else entirely. How did the builders calculate shaft placement and spacing to avoid pockets of stagnant, oxygen-poor air in the deepest chambers? How did they account for smoke dispersal from cooking fires used to feed thousands, without choking the very population they were built to protect? Some of the ventilation shafts also appeared to have doubled as wells, drawing water from underground sources, meaning the same vertical channels may have served two critical and potentially conflicting survival functions simultaneously. Coordinating that kind of dual-purpose infrastructure across a structure this size implies not just labor, but planning on a scale that historians are still working to fully map. Most archaeologists maintain that this achievement, however impressive, reflects incremental development rather than a single masterstroke of design, a system refined gradually over centuries, as successive generations expanded and improved upon what earlier inhabitants had already dug. Trial, error, and inherited knowledge passed down through generations of a community with strong motivation to get it right could plausibly account for a ventilation network this sophisticated, even without written engineering plans. It is not, in this view, evidence of lost knowledge, simply evidence of patient, generational problem-solving under sustained pressure. But there are lesser explored levels of Derinkuyu that complicate even this careful explanation. Not all sections of the complex have been fully excavated or mapped. Some tunnels remain sealed by rubble, deliberately blocked, or simply unexplored due to structural safety concerns. In certain deeper areas, researchers have noted variations in shaft construction and chamber layout that don't neatly match the pattern of gradual, additive expansion seen elsewhere in the complex. sections that appear more deliberately unified in design, as though planned as a whole rather than built up piecemeal over generations. Are these anomalies simply the result of a particularly skilled builder working in a later era? Or do they suggest an earlier, more concentrated phase of construction whose origins have not yet been identified? There is also the matter of scale relative to necessity. Derinkuyu wasn't alone. It connects, via tunnel, to the underground city of Kamakla and possibly others nearby, suggesting an entire underground network stretching beneath the Cappadocian landscape, much of which remains unexcavated. How far does it extend? How many more chambers, shafts, and sealed doors lie waiting beneath the volcanic rock, still holding their air, their silence, their unanswered questions? Excavation continues, cautiously, level by level. Each newly opened chamber offers another fragment of the story, and just as often, another reason to wonder how much of Derinkuyu's full design was ever meant to be understood by those who didn't build it. Derinkuyu hides its mysteries beneath solid rock. Nearly 5,000 kilometers northeast, in one of the most isolated corners of southern Siberia, another mystery sits in plain sight, above ground, exposed to sky and wind, and somehow no less difficult to explain. On a small island in the middle of remote Lake Terikol, in the Tuva Republic near the Mongolian border, the ruins of Por-Bazhyn rise from water that reflects some of the harshest, most inaccessible terrain in Russia. The name means clay house in the Tuvan language, and the structure lives up to it. A massive rectangular complex, its outer walls once standing 4 stories tall, and at their base, roughly 12 meters thick, built not from imported stone but from rammed earth and clay, using the same construction technique found in classical Chinese architecture. The walls enclose an area over 200 meters long, oriented precisely east to west. Inside, the outlines of more than 30 structures remain visible, arranged with an axial symmetry that echoes imperial palace design far to the south and east. The mainstream account, refined considerably over the past 2 decades, is grounded in real evidence. Por-Bazhyn has been linked to the Uyghurs since the late 19th century, based on its location, the age of recovered artifacts, and its resemblance to Karabalgasyn, capital of the Uyghur Khaganate. Its central complex follows Tang-style layout, using Chinese construction methods and roofing materials. In 2020, an international research team applied a groundbreaking dating method to the site's timbers, using a sudden datable spike in atmospheric radiocarbon preserved in the wood's growth rings. The findings placed construction under Uyghur ruler Tengri Bogu Khan, beginning in the year 777. Bogu had recently converted the Khaganate's official religion to Manichaeism, and researchers now believe Por-Bazhyn was built not as a palace, but as a Manichaean monastery. 2 years later, he was assassinated in an uprising against that very conversion. It's an elegant explanation, and it answers a question that had puzzled researchers for over a century. Why does this enormous complex show almost no evidence of ever having been lived in? That absence is where Por-Bazhyn's deeper strangeness begins. This wasn't a small or hastily built settlement. The excavations here operate on a scale rarely seen in modern archaeology, involving geologists, geographers, and dendrochronologists working to untangle a site that, despite its size, seems to have barely been touched by daily life. Only a handful of artifacts were ever recovered, far fewer than a permanently occupied complex this large would produce. Excavators also found no remains of stationary heating systems, a feature considered essential for surviving Siberian winters at this elevation, and one present at over a dozen other Uyghur sites in the region. A fortress built to be nearly impregnable, in a location so remote it offered little strategic value, apparently abandoned within 2 years of completion and never rebuilt. The pieces fit together, but only just. Then there's the island itself. Geological survey work revealed that Por-Bazhyn sits atop a plug of permafrost extending beneath the lake, though the surrounding water is not underlain by permafrost, meaning the island may be a far more deliberate feature than it first appears. Whether the lake existed before construction began or formed afterward around the structure remains genuinely unresolved among the geologists studying it. If builders in the 8th century deliberately selected, or even helped shape, a permafrost-anchored island in a shallow alpine lake, at over 2,000 meters elevation, in one of the most punishing environments imaginable, one question keeps returning. Why go to such lengths for a building used so briefly, so far from anywhere that mattered? Older theories, circulating before excavations settled much of the debate, proposed that Por-Bazhyn had served as an astronomical observatory, a ritual center, or a ceremonial memorial rather than a palace or monastery at all. Modern archaeology has largely moved past these ideas, favoring the monastery hypothesis. But largely settled isn't the same as fully resolved. The dating tells us when construction began and ended. It doesn't fully explain why a nomadic khaganate, not typically associated with permanent architecture, imported foreign building techniques wholesale, executed them with striking skill, and poured enormous resources into a structure that would stand empty for less than 3 years before fire and earthquake began pulling it apart. Most of Por-Bazhyn's foundations remain unexcavated, patiently holding whatever record of use or deliberate emptiness still lies beneath the clay. Was this truly a monastery interrupted by history, exactly as the timbers suggest? Or does the island still have layers left to reveal? Questions the tree rings alone can't answer. Por-Bazhyn keeps its silence on a Siberian lake few will ever visit. Nearly 7,000 kilometers west, in the rolling hills of central Italy, another silence waits, not hidden by remoteness, but standing in full view, wrapped around a hilltop town that people walk through every day without fully grasping what they're looking at. The town is Alatri, in the Lazio region southeast of Rome, in a district known as Shoria. At its heart sits a hill, and encircling that hill is a wall. Not a wall of bricks or quarried, evenly cut stone, but of massive polygonal limestone blocks, some standing over a meter across, fitted together without mortar, without cement, without any binding agent at all. The blocks aren't rectangular, they're irregular, many-sided, cut and shaped to interlock with their neighbors like the pieces of a puzzle solved thousands of years ago and never disturbed since. In places, the wall rises to 15 meters. It stretches for well over a kilometer around the Acropolis alone, with an outer circuit extending more than 2 kilometers around the town itself, enclosing roughly 25 hectares of hillside. The people credited with this achievement are the Hernesi, an ancient Italic people who inhabited the region before Rome's expansion absorbed them into its growing republic. Historical sources place the wall's construction sometime between the 7th and 4th centuries BC, though scholars openly admit that dating polygonal masonry with precision remains one of the most persistent challenges in Italian archaeology. Unlike inscribed monuments or datable artifacts recovered in clear stratigraphic layers, a wall built from stacked stone offers few reliable clues about exactly when the first block was set in place. What survives is the wall itself, and the wall, remarkably, has survived extraordinarily well. Historians studying the site consider it among the best preserved examples of this building style anywhere in the ancient world. This construction technique has a name, opus polygonal, or polygonal masonry, and it wasn't unique to Alatri. Similar walls appear across ancient Lazio, built by neighboring peoples like the Volsci and the Aurunci, and later refined by Rome itself. But nowhere, according to those who've studied the region closely, do these walls achieve the scale and precision found at Alatri. The blocks weren't merely stacked. They were cut and dressed so that each irregular face fit its neighbor with almost no gap between them. A level of precision fitting that, even now, engineers examining the wall find difficult to fully explain given the tools believed available at the time. Consider the Porta Maggiore, the main gate leading into the Acropolis. Its opening is capped by a single monolithic limestone lintel, one continuous block, cut from solid stone, spanning the gateway and estimated to weigh in the range of 27 tons. No modern crane was available to the Hernici. No wheeled pulley system on the scale needed to lift and place a stone of that mass has been definitively documented for this culture in this period. And yet the lintel sits exactly where it was placed, unmoved for well over 2,000 years, echoing, as some historians have noted, the same monumental gate-building tradition seen at the Lion Gate of Mycenae, thousands of kilometers away in Greece. That resemblance is where the mainstream explanation begins to open into something more speculative. The very word Cyclopean was applied to walls like this one by people in antiquity who found the scale of the stonework difficult to attribute to ordinary human labor. The term borrows from the mythical Cyclopes, the one-eyed giants of Greek legend said to be the only beings capable of lifting stones this large. Local folklore in Alatri carried a similar thread for centuries, attributing the walls not to the Hernici at all, but to the god Saturn and his demigod sons, part of a small group of so-called Saturnian cities believed to predate conventional history. Archaeologists today treat this as myth rather than method, an ancient culture's way of explaining an achievement that felt, even to them, larger than ordinary human capability. More recent and more contested claims go further still. Some researchers examining the wall's geometry have proposed that its trapezoidal layout wasn't arbitrary, but deliberately aligned, that the perimeter of the Acropolis, when mapped, echoes the pattern of a constellation, and that certain gates along the outer wall display proportions matching the golden ratio with a precision unlikely to be accidental. Mainstream archaeologists remain skeptical of these claims, noting that patterns like the golden ratio can often be found in structures where no one intended them, simply because humans are drawn to aesthetically pleasing proportions in general. Still, the claims persist, circulating alongside the more conventional history, neither fully dismissed nor fully confirmed. What remains undisputed is the wall itself, its scale, its age, and the stubborn precision of its construction. The Hernici left no written explanation of how they moved stones this size, no manual describing their methods, no record of the labor force required. They left only the wall, standing exactly as they built it, indifferent to the centuries of visitors who've walked beneath its gates trying to understand exactly how it was done. Perhaps it required nothing more mysterious than time, skilled hands, and a culture organized enough to sustain the effort across generations. Or perhaps, somewhere in the gaps between the stones, there's a piece of the story that Alatri has simply never told. Alatri's walls have kept their secrets on an Italian hillside for millennia. Across an ocean and half a continent away, high in the Peruvian Andes above the city of Cusco, another set of walls raises the same unanswered questions. And this time, the story doesn't end with a single site. It spreads outward into a constellation of smaller, stranger places that few visitors ever stop to consider. Most people who travel to Cusco know Sacsayhuamán by reputation alone. The massive zigzagging terrace walls on the city's northern edge, built from andesite blocks so large that some are estimated to weigh well over 100 tons, fitted together with a precision so exact that not even a blade slides between them. It's rightly considered one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world. But Sacsayhuamán was never an isolated structure. It sat at the center of a network, smaller sites scattered across the surrounding hills, each carrying its own fragment of the same unresolved mystery. Just a short walk from Sacsayhuamán's famous terraces lies Cuenco, a name that means labyrinth or zigzag in Quechua. At first glance, it looks unremarkable, a low limestone outcrop rising from the grass. Look closer, and the outcrop reveals itself to be entirely reworked. Carved channels zigzag across its surface. An underground chamber has been cut directly into the bedrock, and a raised platform sits above what researchers believe was a ceremonial altar. Chroniclers and modern archaeologists alike suggest liquids, chicha, water, possibly blood, were poured into the carved channels during rituals, the resulting flow patterns read as omens. But how was this stone worked with such control, shaping natural rock into deliberate architecture without shattering it? And what, precisely, were the builders trying to divine? A short distance further sit Puka-Pucara and Tambo-Mache, two sites so close together they're often visited in the same afternoon, yet serving purposes that appear almost opposite. Puka-Pucara, the Red Fortress, takes its name from the reddish hue of its stone at sunset, a compact complex of terraces, walls, and lookout points, generally interpreted as a military checkpoint or way station controlling movement along the road into the sacred valley. Just across from it, Tambo-Mache presents something gentler, a series of stone-carved channels and fountains where water still flows today, nearly 6 centuries after construction, with a consistency and pressure that suggests careful hydraulic engineering rather than accident. Local tradition calls it the Bath of the Inca. What's harder to explain is how builders working without modern surveying tools achieved channels precise enough to maintain steady water flow across centuries of seismic activity in one of the most geologically active regions on Earth. Then there's the quarry that connects them all. At Rumicolca, roughly 35 kilometers from Cusco, researchers have documented the source of much of the andesite used at Sacsayhuamán, a site where partially finished blocks and abandoned tools still lie exactly where they were left. Studies comparing tool marks at the quarry to experimental stone cutting have found close matches, lending strong support to the idea that the Inca used hammerstones, patience, and an intimate understanding of stone fracture patterns to shape these blocks, no exotic technology required. Chroniclers, writing shortly after the Spanish conquest, recorded oral traditions describing tens of thousands of workers, organized in rotating labor drafts, hauling stones using ropes, log rollers, and earthen ramps over the course of decades. It's a labor-intensive picture, but not necessarily an impossible one. Human ingenuity and sustained coordinated effort, rather than lost technology. And yet, gaps remain in even this well-supported account. Not every stone at Sacsayhuamán has been definitively traced to Rumicolca. Some researchers suspect closer, still unidentified sources may have supplied at least part of the material, which would mean the full transportation network hasn't yet been mapped. The precision fitting itself, blocks with as many as a dozen distinct angles, interlocking with neighboring stones to tolerances measured in millimeters, remains something modern masons find difficult to replicate even with contemporary tools, let alone hammerstones and patience alone. Was this level of precision purely functional, an earthquake-resistant design refined through generations of trial and error in a seismically active landscape? Or did it carry a symbolic weight we no longer fully understand, each satellite site playing a role in some larger design connecting fortress, altar, and spring? The Inca left no blueprints. What they left instead is a landscape reshaped with startling intention, Walls, channels, and carved stone spread across the hills above Cusco, each site distinct, each site part of something larger. Rumi Kolka's abandoned quarry still holds half-finished blocks, frozen mid-labor, as though the workers simply walked away one day and never returned to finish the job. What were they building toward? And how much of the full picture still lies scattered across those hills, waiting to be reassembled? Sacsayhuamán's satellite sites scatter their questions across the hills above Cusco. Cross the Atlantic once more, north this time, to an island in the middle of the Mediterranean, and a different kind of stone monument rises from a quiet plain, one that has stood, unmortared and largely unexplained, for nearly 4,000 years. The plain is called Cabu Abbas in the Logudoro Mailogu region of northern Sardinia, near the small town of Torralba. Rising from its center is Nuraghe Santu Antine, locally known as Saidomo de Su Rey, the House of the King. Even at a distance, it dominates the landscape. A massive central tower built from huge basalt blocks, standing 17 meters tall today, though researchers believe it once reached 23 or 24 meters, roughly the height of an 8-story building. 3 smaller towers flank it, connected by curtain walls, forming a triangular bastion that, seen from above, resembles a great stone clover. Every block, from the largest foundation stones to the smaller ones higher up, was set in place using nothing but careful stacking and gravity. No mortar, no cement, no binding material of any kind. Santu Antine is one of roughly 7,000 or 8,000 Nuraghe scattered across Sardinia, the defining architectural signature of the Nuragic civilization, a prehistoric culture that inhabited the island exclusively, leaving behind almost no written record of who they were or how they organized their society. Archaeologists date the construction of Santu Antine's central tower to somewhere between the 19th and 16th centuries BC, with later additions continuing into the Iron Age, meaning parts of the structure are approaching 4,000 years old. Astronomer and historian Michael Hoskin, who studied the site extensively, once called it the most sophisticated dry stone construction on the planet, a description that becomes harder to dismiss the longer you stand inside it. Step through the entrance and the sense of scale only deepens. Long corridors, some stretching 27 meters, wind through the structure on 2 separate levels, built using the corbel arch technique, a method where each successive ring of stones projects slightly inward until the gap closes at the top, forming a self-supporting vault without a single keystone. The central tower contains 3 chambers stacked directly on top of one another, each capped with a tholos, a false dome created the same way, ring by ring, stone by stone, narrowing gradually into a rounded ceiling. A spiral staircase, cut directly into the thickness of the walls, connects the levels. Even the well in the central courtyard, still intact after millennia, speaks to a builder's mind thinking beyond mere shelter, toward siege readiness, water security, long-term survival. The mainstream explanation for how this was achieved has grown considerably more detailed in recent years. A study examining the internal engineering of Nuraghe like Santu Antine found that the space between the outer wall and the internal tholos chambers wasn't left hollow. It was deliberately packed with loose granular fill, distributing weight and pressure in a way that stabilizes the entire structure without requiring mortar at all. In effect, the builders weren't relying on the stones alone to hold each other up. They were using the mass and friction of packed material behind the walls as a kind of internal skeleton, a technique modern engineers only recently reconstructed through careful structural analysis. It's an elegant solution, one requiring an intuitive, empirically developed understanding of weight distribution without any of the mathematical formalism we'd associate with structural engineering today. And yet, elegant as that explanation is, it raises its own set of questions rather than closing the book entirely. How did a Bronze Age society, without written records, without evidence of formalized engineering training, develop and transmit this level of structural knowledge consistently enough to replicate it across thousands of separate towers throughout the island? Why does the technique appear already fairly refined even in some of the earliest examples, rather than showing an obvious, gradual trial-and-error progression from crude to sophisticated? And what, precisely, was worth this level of investment? Worth quarrying, transporting, and precisely stacking thousands of massive basalt blocks, generation after generation, across an island that left behind so few other records of its own history? Scholars still don't agree on what Nuraghe were fundamentally for. Defensive fortresses, seats of local power, religious centers, granaries, or some combination that shifted over centuries of use and reuse, all remain live possibilities, debated without full resolution. The Nuraghic people who built Santu Antine left no inscriptions explaining their intentions, no king's name carved above the entrance, nothing but the stones themselves and the silence surrounding them. Excavation and structural study continue, slowly revealing more about how these towers stayed standing for so long. But the deeper question, why a prehistoric island culture reached this level of architectural sophistication, and what drove them to build not one such structure, but thousands, remains as unresolved as the day archaeologists first began asking it. What else might these towers still be holding inside their carefully packed, silent walls? Santu Antine's towers rise from the Sardinian plain like fortified stone giants. But northern Sardinia holds an older mystery still, one that predates the Nuraghe by well over 1,000 years, and doesn't look like anything else built in Europe before or since. The site sits on the edge of the Nura Plain, not far from the city of Sacsayhuamán, and for most of its existence it hid in plain sight, mistaken, for centuries, for nothing more than a natural hill. In 1954, archaeologist Ercole Contu began excavating what he expected to be the base of a nuraghe. What he found instead was something far older and far stranger, a massive, truncated pyramidal platform built from stacked limestone, rising from what had genuinely appeared to be an unremarkable rise in the landscape. Today, the site is known as Monte da Codi, a name that may derive from an old word simply meaning stone. The scale, once uncovered, was startling. The platform's base measures roughly 36 by 29 meters, standing today at a height of around 10 meters, though it may originally have risen even higher. A long ceremonial ramp, over 40 meters in length, rises gradually to the top. No stairs, just a wide, sloping approach, designed for a slow, deliberate ascent. And the dating is what truly sets Monte da Codi apart. The earliest structure beneath the visible platform has been traced to roughly 4000 to 3650 BC, built by a culture that predates the Osireion civilization associated with the monument's later, larger phase. That places its origins well over 5,500 years in the past, centuries before the first pyramids rose in Egypt, and roughly contemporary with the earliest proto-ziggurats beginning to appear in Mesopotamia, thousands of kilometers to the east. That resemblance to Mesopotamian architecture is impossible to ignore, and archaeologists themselves have drawn the comparison directly. The stepped, truncated form, the long ceremonial ramp, the elevated platform meant to lift ritual activity above the surrounding landscape. All of it echoes the ziggurats of Uruk and later Mesopotamian cities, structures built to bring priests and ritual closer to the heavens. And yet, Monte da Codi sits in Sardinia, isolated by open sea from the civilizations it most resembles, built by a Neolithic culture that left no writing, no inscriptions, nothing beyond the stones themselves and the objects scattered around them. Excavation around the platform revealed a wider sacred landscape, the remains of a village with rectangular huts, a large standing stone over 4 meters tall, a slab pierced with 7 holes that some researchers believe may have secured sacrificial animals, and carved spheroidal boulders whose exact ritual purpose remains genuinely uncertain. Animal remains found near the structure, sheep, cattle, pigs, suggest sacrifice played a central role in whatever ceremonies took place here. But no chambers, no burial rooms, no interior spaces of any kind have been found within the platform itself. It appears to have been built as a stage rather than a container, a place for something to happen on top of it rather than something to be sealed inside it. This absence is where the mainstream explanation begins to invite more speculative questions. Why would a Neolithic society on an isolated Mediterranean island, seemingly independent of contact with the great river civilizations forming to the east, arrive at such a strikingly similar architectural solution? Elevated platform, ceremonial ramp, open-air altar, for what appears to be a broadly similar ritual purpose. Most archaeologists favor parallel development, separate cultures facing similar spiritual and social needs, arriving independently at similar architectural answers, much as unrelated cultures elsewhere have built pyramidal or stepped structures without any contact at all. It's a reasonable, well-supported position, but a smaller number of researchers have proposed something bolder, pointing to local legend, recorded long before modern excavation, describing the site as built by a prince or priest who had fled from somewhere in the Near East. Mainstream archaeology treats this as folklore rather than fact, unsupported by any direct evidence of migration or contact. Still, the coincidence of form and near coincidence of era continues to invite the question, even if the evidence hasn't yet answered it. The platform's later builders, centuries after the first structure was raised, actually made a striking choice. Rather than clearing away the original monument, they buried it entirely beneath a new layer of earth and stone, then built an even larger platform directly on top, following the same essential design. Why preserve the old structure rather than replacing it outright? Was this reverence for what had come before? A conscious act of continuity, generation after generation returning to the same sacred ground for over 1,000 years? Or something more practical, a foundation simply too useful to discard? Monte Dakoti was eventually abandoned, its final ceremonies fading sometime after 1800 BC, as the Nuraghe began rising across the island in its place. What it was truly for, who stood atop that ramp, what words or rites accompanied the animals brought there for sacrifice, remains locked in a silence as old as the platform itself. Was this simply a Neolithic society reaching independently for the same architectural instincts as civilizations an ocean away? Or did some thread connect them, one that has yet to surface from beneath the stone? Monte Dakoti's platform holds its silence beneath open Sardinian sky. Turn north into the heartland of Bavaria and Austria, and the mystery goes underground entirely, into passages so narrow, so strange, and so persistently unexplained that even the experts who've spent their careers studying them admit defeat. If you were to dig beneath a rural farmhouse almost anywhere in Bavaria, there's a real chance you'd break through into one. A passage barely wide enough for a human body to squeeze through, often 60 to 90 centimeters across, cut cleanly through bedrock or compacted clay. It might run 10 meters or 100. It might branch, double back, open briefly into a small chamber just large enough for 2 or 3 people to sit, then narrow again into a crawlway and end abruptly, inexplicably, in a blank wall. These are the Erdstall tunnels, and more than 2,000 of them have been documented across Bavaria, Austria, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and parts of France, with researchers suspecting that thousands more remain undiscovered, sealed beneath fields and foundations, waiting for a subsiding floor or a farmer's shovel to find them again. The name itself comes from medieval German, roughly translating to Earth Place or Earth Passage. The first documented mention appears in a 1449 tax record from the Austrian town of Aspern, referencing land described simply as lying above the Erdstalls, proof that people knew these tunnels existed centuries ago, even if no one wrote down why they were built. Systematic study began with a Benedictine monk named Lambert Karner, who spent decades in the late 1800s exploring and cataloging examples across the region, publishing his findings in 1903. Karner's most important contribution wasn't a solution, it was ruling things out. He demonstrated that the tunnels were too narrow, too awkwardly shaped, and too impractically laid out to have functioned as genuine emergency shelters or long-term hiding places, despite that being one of the most persistent popular theories. That's where the mainstream picture stands today, largely unchanged after more than a century of investigation. Radiocarbon dating of the rare organic materials recovered from these sites, charcoal, occasional tool fragments, has consistently placed construction in the High Middle Ages, roughly the 10th through 13th centuries. This finding directly contradicted an earlier and more sensational claim, popularized starting around 2011, that Erdstalls formed a single continuous network stretching from Scotland to Turkey, dug as far back as the Stone Age. That version of the story doesn't hold up. The tunnels aren't interconnected. Each is an isolated system, and the dating evidence points firmly to the medieval period rather than deep prehistory. What makes Erdstalls genuinely difficult to explain isn't their age. It's their emptiness. Almost none contain artifacts of any kind. No pottery, no tools, no bones, no writing. Nothing that would indicate sustained human use or clear function. They typically have a single entrance and exit, often concealed beneath the floor of a farmhouse or positioned near a church or cemetery. And critically, despite popular claims connecting them to water systems or hydraulic engineering, no consistent evidence supports that theory either. The tunnels show no channels, no consistent gradient toward drainage, no lining suited to moving or storing water. Several do sit below the local water table and flood seasonally, but archaeologists studying them generally agree this reflects an unintended consequence of their depth, not a deliberate hydraulic design. Whatever function these tunnels served, managing water does not appear to have been the primary intention. So, what were they for? Historian Anton Haschner proposed one of the more evocative interpretations, that Erdstalls functioned as symbolic empty tombs built by medieval communities as dwellings for the souls of ancestors awaiting final judgment, a practice, he suggested, that faded as the doctrine of purgatory spread through the church in the later 11th century. Others have pointed to Alpine and Germanic folklore describing Erdmenican, or earth spirits, and proposed the tunnels were built as symbolic gateways or dwellings for these beings, straddling the line between engineering and belief. Still others favor a more practical reading, temporary refuges built during periods of genuine regional violence, when concealing people or valuables underground, however imperfectly, was preferable to leaving them exposed. Modern researchers cataloging Erdstall sites in Bavaria have connected some clusters to documented periods of raiding along the region's frontier, suggesting the timing, at least, lines up. None of these explanations has been confirmed. None fully accounts for every feature these tunnels share: their consistent narrowness, their careful construction, their near total absence of evidence for what happened inside them, and the apparent deliberateness with which so many were sealed and left undisturbed for the better part of 1,000 years. Whoever built them chose not to leave a record. Whether that silence was born of secrecy, ritual restraint, or simply a purpose too mundane to write down, no one has been able to say with confidence. Somewhere beneath a field in Bavaria right now, there is almost certainly another Erdstall no living person knows about. Narrow, dark, and precisely built, waiting for the next foundation dug too deep, or the next archaeologist patient enough to ask, once again, why anyone would carve a passage like this into the earth and choose to say nothing about it. The Erdstall tunnels of Bavaria hide their questions in narrow, empty passages beneath medieval farmhouses. Travel southeast, past the mountains and deserts of the Middle East, to a low coastal mound on the northern shore of the island of Bahrain, and a very different kind of hidden history waits, not beneath a single village, but layered, quite literally, inside the earth itself. The site is called Qal'at al-Bahrain, and at first glance it presents itself simply, a weathered stone fort, its walls built by Portuguese colonizers in the 16th century, standing atop a broad artificial hill on the fertile north coast, visible from a distance as a kind of sentinel guarding the approach to what is now the capital, Manama. Tourists come to walk its ramparts and take in the view, but the fort itself is almost incidental to what lies beneath it. The mound it stands on isn't a natural hill at all. It's what archaeologists call a tell, an artificial rise built up over thousands of years, layer upon layer, as one civilization after another built, collapsed, and was built over again on the exact same spot. Excavations beginning in 1954, led initially by a Danish archaeological expedition, revealed just how deep that history runs. Beneath the Portuguese fort, researchers found 7 distinct stratified layers, spanning continuous human occupation from around 2300 BC through the 18th century. Nearly 4,000 years of settlement compressed into a mound just 12 meters high. Kassites, Greeks, Persians, and Portuguese each left their mark here, one culture's foundations becoming the next culture's bedrock. It's a rare kind of site, a single physical location where nearly the entire sweep of Gulf history can be read, quite literally, in vertical sequence. But the earliest and most significant layer belongs to none of these later powers. It belongs to Dilmun, one of the oldest civilizations in the region, and for centuries, one of the most mysterious. Qal'at al-Bahrain was Dilmun's capital, a bustling trading port that connected 2 of the ancient world's great civilizations, Mesopotamia to the northwest and the Indus Valley to the east. Artifacts recovered from the site tell that story clearly. Cuneiform inscriptions and hematite linked to Mesopotamia. Steatite bowls connected to Oman, carnelian beads and stone weights tracing back to the Indus civilization itself. Dilmun sat precisely at the crossroads, and Qal'at al-Bahrain was where those crossroads converged. What makes Dilmun especially compelling isn't only the trade goods, it's the mythology. In Sumerian texts, Dilmun appears again and again not simply as a trading partner, but as something closer to a paradise, a pure land, untouched by sickness, aging, or death, where, in the words of the ancient poem Enki and Ninhursag, the raven does not caw and the wolf does not snatch the lamb. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature, the hero travels to Dilmun, specifically in search of Utnapishtim, the sole human granted eternal life by the gods after surviving a great flood. Utnapishtim, the text tells us, was settled by the gods in Dilmun, at the mouth of the rivers, a real trading port, described in cuneiform tablets as the mythological home of immortality itself. Scholars have long debated exactly how literally to read this connection, but the fact remains, an actual, excavatable archaeological site, a working ancient port with warehouses and residential quarters and city walls, was also, to the people of Mesopotamia, the place where the boundary between mortal and immortal was said to dissolve. That tension between the mundane, well-documented reality of Dilmun as a trading capital and the mythological weight the Sumerians placed on it is where Qal'at al-Bahrain's deeper mystery lives, and it's compounded by a simple, almost startling fact. Despite more than 70 years of excavation, only about a quarter of the tell has actually been dug. The remaining 3/4, the bulk of nearly 4,000 years of compressed human history, remains unexplored, sealed beneath the ground exactly as it has been for centuries, or millennia, depending on the layer. What sits within that unexcavated 75% is, quite genuinely, unknown. Archaeologists working the site have found residential structures, public buildings, commercial warehouses, religious spaces, and military fortifications in the portion they've uncovered. Evidence of a complex, layered urban society operating continuously across an extraordinary span of time. If that pattern holds throughout the rest of the mound, then whatever remains buried likely includes further temples, more extensive residential quarters, additional trade records, and layers connecting Dilmun's earliest Bronze Age beginnings to periods still poorly understood even by specialists. Roughly 600 meters offshore from the tell, a sea tower, thought to be an ancient lighthouse, and a channel cut through the coral reef further hint at the scale of maritime infrastructure that once served this port. How much of that infrastructure and the settlements that supported it still lies beneath sand and silt, uncatalogued. There's also the matter of Dilmun's own origins, which remain only partially resolved even among specialists. Some scholars argue the civilization's roots lie even earlier than the earliest excavated layers at Qal'at al-Bahrain suggest, based on textual references in even older Mesopotamian records that hint at trade contact predating the site's confirmed occupation. If true, evidence of that earlier period, if it survives at all, would lie in ground that hasn't yet been touched by a single archaeologist's trowel. Every excavation season at Qal'at al-Bahrain adds another fragment to the story, another wall, another seal, another layer of a civilization that once stood, in the imagination of its neighbors, at the very edge of paradise. But the site's own geography ensures the story remains incomplete. Beneath the Portuguese fort's weathered stone, beneath the layers already carefully mapped and dated, 3/4 of Dilmun's capital still waits in the dark, patient, undisturbed, and entirely unread. What does the rest of the mound remember? And how much of Dilmun's paradise, real or mythologized, is still waiting to be uncovered? Qal'at al-Bahrain still holds 3/4 of its story beneath unexcavated earth. Travel east across the Arabian Sea to a remote, salt-cracked island in the great Rann of Kutch in western India, and you'll find a city that solved one of the oldest problems in human settlement: water scarcity, with an engineering sophistication that continues to astonish the researchers studying it more than 4,000 years later. The city is Dholavira, and its location alone raises the first question. Built on the island of Qadir, surrounded by one of the harshest, most arid landscapes in the Indian subcontinent, Dholavira had no permanent river to rely on. Only 2 small seasonal streams, the Mansar and the Manhar, which ran dry for much of the year. The nearby Arabian Sea offered no relief. Its water was unusable for drinking or agriculture. And yet Dholavira, a major city of the Harappan civilization occupied from roughly 3000 to 1700 BC, became one of the largest and longest-lived settlements of the entire Indus Valley tradition. A civilization whose urban centers are consistently, and rightly, celebrated for engineering achievements that predate comparable systems in much of the ancient world by more than 1,000 years. The key to that survival, and to Dholavira's enduring reputation among archaeologists, lies in water. Within the city's fortified walls, researchers have identified 16 separate reservoirs, engineered into the urban layout with remarkable precision. The city itself was built across a natural 13-meter slope, descending from a higher citadel in the northeast down to lower ground in the southwest, and Dholavira's builders used that slope deliberately, arranging their reservoirs in a cascading sequence, connected by channels and separated by earthen and stone bunds that controlled the flow of water from one basin to the next. Monsoon rain, seasonal stream flow, and runoff were all captured, directed, and stored, rather than left to flood the city or vanish into the arid ground. The largest of these reservoirs stretches over 70 meters long and nearly 30 meters wide, a scale that speaks to just how central water management was to the city's survival and to its social organization. Excavations led by archaeologist R.S. Bisht revealed just how deliberately engineered this system was. Several reservoirs were cut directly into bedrock and lined with stone to prevent seepage. Rock-cut wells, some considered among the earliest known examples of true stepwells. Structures where descending stone staircases lead down to the water table, allowing access even as levels dropped through the dry season, appear within the citadel itself. One of them positioned prominently enough, near a discovered unicorn figurine, that some researchers suspect it carried ceremonial as well as practical significance. Elsewhere, check dams have been identified along the seasonal streams feeding into the city, channeling water through stone-cut passages toward the reservoir network, a feature that, so far, appears unique to Dholavira among excavated Indus Valley sites. What continues to draw serious scholarly attention, though, isn't simply that this system existed. It's how precisely calibrated it appears to have been. The gradients built into Dholavira's channels and drains are remarkably shallow, in some cases estimated at roughly a 1 in 10,000 slope, just steep enough to keep water moving steadily toward its destination without eroding the surrounding stone or brickwork. Achieving that kind of consistency across an entire city, without the benefit of modern surveying instruments, required an intuitive but exact understanding of gravity, gradient, and flow, the same underlying principles that govern hydraulic engineering today, arrived at through observation, iteration, and an evidently deep familiarity with how water actually behaves. This is where the picture, already impressive on its own terms, begins to attract more speculative interpretation. Some researchers have gone further, suggesting that the layout of Dholavira's western reservoirs in particular reflects deliberate seasonal planning, that certain basins were positioned and prioritized based on anticipated monsoon patterns, possibly informed by astronomical observation of seasonal cycles. It's a compelling idea, and Harappan civilization certainly demonstrates sophisticated standardization elsewhere, including finely graduated measurement tools recovered from other Indus sites. But direct evidence connecting Dholavira's reservoir management to formal astronomical prediction remains thin, and mainstream archaeology treats this specific claim with considerably more caution than the drainage engineering itself, which rests on far firmer excavated ground. There's also the matter of what we still don't fully understand about the Western Reservoir complex specifically. While the Eastern and Central reservoirs have received the most sustained archaeological attention, portions of the Western system remain less thoroughly mapped, their connections to the broader channel network only partially traced. Were these reservoirs functionally identical to their Eastern counterparts, or did they serve some distinct purpose? Agricultural rather than domestic, perhaps, or reserved for periods of particular scarcity. The bunds separating individual reservoirs also served as walkways through the city, meaning Dholavira's inhabitants moved through their water infrastructure daily, threading between full basins and dry ones, in a landscape where the presence or absence of water was made physically, visibly part of everyday urban life. What did it mean to live inside a city where survival was engineered so visibly into the ground beneath your feet? Dholavira's civilization, like much of the Indus Valley tradition, eventually declined, a process researchers still debate, with shifting river courses and prolonged drought both proposed as contributing factors, a grim irony for a city built so entirely around the mastery of water. The reservoirs themselves, empty now, remain remarkably intact after 4,000 years, their stone linings and stepped walls still visible to visitors walking the site today. What true purpose lay behind every channel, every calibrated gradient, every rock-cut well in this city built entirely against the odds of its own landscape? And how much of Dholavira's western reservoir network, its connections, its seasonal logic, its full extent, still waits beneath ground that hasn't yet been fully opened to the light? Dholavira's reservoirs prove a Bronze Age city could master water on an arid desert island. High in the cloud forests of northern Peru, at nearly 3,000 meters above sea level, a very different civilization faced the opposite problem. Not scarcity, but altitude, isolation, and stone, and left behind an architectural puzzle that archaeologists are still working to fully untangle. The site is Kuélap, perched along a narrow ridge in the Utcubamba Valley of Peru's Amazonas region, built by the Chachapoya, a highland culture the Inca themselves came to call the warriors of the clouds, for the way their settlements seem to float above the mist that perpetually wraps this part of the Andes. Long before the Inca ever reached this territory, the Chachapoya were already raising a fortified city here, its construction beginning as early as the 5th or 6th century AD and continuing for centuries afterward. What they built rivals, in sheer scale, almost anything else in the Andes. An outer perimeter wall stretching over 600 meters in length, rising in places to nearly 20 meters, taller than a 6-story building, enclosing more than 400 circular stone structures across roughly 6 hectares of ridgetop terrain. Even before stepping inside, the wall itself tells a story of deliberate, careful engineering. Constructed from massive limestone blocks, some sources estimate over 400,000 cubic meters of stone were used across the entire site. The wall's few entrances were built as narrow, funnel-shaped corridors, gradually tapering inward, forcing anyone entering to pass through single file, unable to move quickly or in numbers. It's a defensive design, clearly intentional, and it places Kuélap firmly in the tradition of fortified highland settlements built by cultures under real and recurring threat. Step through those narrow gates, though, and the architecture shifts into something less immediately explicable. Unlike the rectangular trapezoidal forms so characteristic of later Inca construction, Kuélap's interior is dominated almost entirely by circular stone buildings, a design choice unique to the Chachapoya within Andean architecture, and one whose structural logic archaeologists are still working through. Many of these round structures rose with conical thatched roofs supported by internal wooden frameworks, resting atop stone foundation walls faced with intricate friezes, geometric zigzags, diamond patterns, and occasionally zoomorphic carvings depicting feline eyes, serpents, and birds, each pattern possibly marking distinctions in clan identity, status, or ritual function that remain only partially understood today. The circular form itself may have offered genuine structural advantages at this altitude and in this climate: better resistance to wind loading, more even weight distribution, a shape naturally suited to the region's seismic activity. But why the Chachapoya committed so thoroughly to this form, while neighboring highland cultures developed differently, remains an open question in itself. The most genuinely enigmatic structure at Kuélap, though, sits near the southern end of the complex, a solitary, inverted cone-shaped building known as El Tintero, the inkwell, rising roughly 5.5 meters, with a carved face in bas-relief on its eastern side. Unlike the surrounding roundhouses, El Tintero tapers narrower at its base than at its top, an unusual inversion of typical load-bearing logic, requiring careful internal stonework to remain stable across the centuries. Archaeologists remain genuinely divided on what it was for. Some propose it functioned as a solar observatory, its unusual geometry allowing for precise tracking of celestial alignment. Others suggest a water cistern, storing rainfall for ceremonial or practical use. Still others have proposed something starker, a place of confinement, a kind of prison chamber, its narrow, deep interior serving to isolate rather than to observe or store. None of these theories has been definitively confirmed, and the structure's true purpose remains, by the account of researchers who've studied it directly, simply unknown. That uncertainty around El Tintero connects to a broader, more practical mystery that runs through the entire site. Kuélap sits on a mountain ridge, far above any obvious water source, in a location chosen deliberately for its defensibility rather than its convenience. And yet, a settlement of this scale, one that may have housed several thousand people at its height, required a reliable, sustained water supply to survive at all. Researchers who have studied the site closely acknowledge that it remains unclear precisely how water was transported to this remote, elevated location, or how thoroughly the Chachapoya solved a challenge that, at lower and flatter Andean sites, might have been managed through visible canals or reservoirs. Whatever system existed here, whether cisterns, channels, or structures like El Tintero pressed into hydraulic service, much of it hasn't survived in a form clear enough for modern archaeology to fully reconstruct. Excavation and restoration work at Kuélap remains ongoing, and much of the site, particularly the internal layout connecting its lower and upper terraces, and the full extent of its residential, ceremonial, and storage functions, is still being mapped in detail. Some structures show signs of having served domestic purposes. Others appear connected to ritual or funerary practices, and the relationship between the site's clearly defensive exterior and its more contemplative, ceremonially decorated interior continues to complicate any simple description of what Kuélap actually was. Fortress, sanctuary, administrative capital, or some fusion the Chachapoya themselves might not have separated into these categories at all. When the site was eventually abandoned, its thatched conical roofs were burned, leaving charred beams as the last physical trace of a city that, for reasons still debated, fell silent. What compelled a civilization to build so ambitiously, so defensively, at such elevation and removed from easier ground? And what does the shape of El Tintero, still standing exactly as its builders left it, still refuse to tell us about the water, the rituals, or the lives it may once have held inside? Kuélap's roundhouses keep their silence above the Peruvian cloud forest. Travel now to the opposite side of the world, into the low hills of Bihar in northeastern India, where an entirely different kind of ancient wall, older by centuries than almost anything discussed so far in this exploration, still traces its way across the landscape. 40 kilometers of stacked, unmortared stone encircling a city whose name once meant something close to royal residence. The city is Rajgir, known in antiquity as Rajgriha, and its setting alone tells you something about why its builders chose this ground. Rajgir sits cradled among 5 hills: Ratnagiri, Vipulagiri, Sonagiri, Udayagiri, and Vaibhavagiri. And rather than fighting that terrain, the wall's ancient engineers worked with it, tracing the natural contours of the surrounding ridgelines to create a defensive perimeter that used elevation itself as a weapon. What remains of the wall today is fragmentary, worn by more than 2,000 years of weather, vegetation, and reuse. But where it survives, it still shows massive, undressed stone blocks, stacked without mortar, roughly 4 to 5 meters wide at points, holding their position through sheer mass, careful placement, and, according to some who've studied the surviving sections, a deliberate inward tilt designed to resist both external force and the region's seismic activity. This wall is widely regarded as one of the oldest surviving fortifications in the Indian subcontinent, and possibly the earliest confirmed pre-Mauryan stone fortification found anywhere in India. That places its origins before the rise of one of history's great empires, in an era when the region was divided among competing kingdoms known as the Mahajanapadas, each vying for territory, resources, and political dominance. Rajgir served as the capital of one of the most powerful of these, the Kingdom of Magadha, and archaeological evidence, including the presence of a distinctive pottery style known as Northern Black Polished Ware, helps place the wall's earliest construction phase in roughly the 6th century BC, with a later expansion added centuries afterward. Even this dating, though, isn't entirely settled. Different sources and traditions offer conflicting timelines. Some scholarly accounts place the earliest phase in the 6th century BC tied to the Haryanka dynasty rulers Bimbisara and his son Ajatashatru. Others associate the wall more directly with the Mauryan Empire several centuries later, and local legend in Rajgir attributes an even older layer of construction to a semi-legendary king named Jarasandha, said to have ruled generations before either historical figure, protecting his capital sometime before 324 BC. Untangling exactly which stones belong to which era and which ruler commissioned which stretch of wall remains an active and genuinely unresolved question for archaeologists working the site, a rare instance where the historical record, rather than resolving the mystery, actually deepens it. What isn't in dispute is the wall's strategic importance. Historical accounts describe Rajgir's fortifications as central to Magadha's military campaigns, including a prolonged conflict under Ajatashatru against the neighboring Vajji Confederacy, a war that, according to tradition, stretched on for well over a decade, with Rajgir's defenses allowing the kingdom to sustain extended operations while keeping its capital secure. Pali Buddhist texts, some of the oldest surviving written records connected to the region, describe the fortified city as having 32 large gates and 64 smaller ones, an extraordinary level of controlled access for a settlement of this age, suggesting not just military planning but a sophisticated understanding of urban movement, trade regulation, and crowd control that predates comparable systems recorded elsewhere in the ancient world by a significant margin. And Rajgir's importance extends well beyond military history. This is also the setting for some of the earliest and most significant events in Buddhist and Jain tradition. The city is closely associated with the life of the Buddha, who is said to have spent considerable time here, and it later hosted the first Buddhist council following his death, an event that helped shape the earliest transmission of Buddhist teaching. A fortified capital of this significance, then, wasn't merely defending territory. It was safeguarding what would become one of the most consequential religious and philosophical centers in human history, a convergence of military engineering and spiritual significance that few other ancient sites can claim so directly. The engineering itself continues to raise questions that outlast the wall's political history. How did a pre-Mauryan society, without iron tools more advanced than rudimentary quarrying implements, extract, transport, and precisely fit stones of this scale across 40 kilometers of uneven, hilly terrain? Some field studies point to a combination of animal power, wooden sledges, and pulley systems, plausible, labor-intensive methods requiring enormous coordinated effort, but not requiring any technology beyond what's reasonably attributed to the period. And yet, the sheer continuity of the project, a single defensive concept, sustained and expanded across multiple ruling dynasties over centuries, implies an institutional memory, a transmitted engineering tradition that's difficult to fully reconstruct from the fragments that survive. Nearby, adding another unresolved layer to the site, visitors can find a set of parallel grooves cut deep into solid rock, the so-called chariot wheel marks, accompanied by an inscribed script that has yet to be fully deciphered, estimated by some to date between the 1st and 5th centuries AD. Local tradition attributes the marks to the legendary chariot of Krishna. Archaeologists studying the inscription itself have offered no confirmed reading. It's a small mystery layered onto a much larger one, a reminder that even within a site as historically documented as Rajgir, gaps remain that neither legend nor scholarship has fully closed. Much of the Cyclopean wall has vanished entirely, reclaimed by centuries of vegetation, erosion, and reuse of its stones for later construction. What survives is only a fraction of the original 40-kilometer circuit. Fragments, hillside sections, and foundation traces that hint at a defensive achievement whose full scale can now only be partially reconstructed. Who truly commissioned its earliest stones? How much of what protected this cradle of Buddhist and Jain history still lies buried beneath the hills, waiting for the wall's missing sections to be found and finally read in full? Rajgir's stone walls trace their ancient defenses across the hills of Bihar in daylight. Travel now to the quiet farmland of northern France, to a village of barely 1,000 people, and the mystery turns inward and downward into a hand-carved subterranean world that hid successfully and repeatedly for the better part of 2,000 years. The village is Naours, tucked into the Picardy countryside not far from Amiens, and from the surface there's little to suggest what lies beneath its cobbled streets and quiet farmhouses. But descend roughly 30 meters below ground, and the landscape opens into something extraordinary. 28 galleries and more than 300 separate chambers, hand-carved from soft limestone bedrock, stretching for several kilometers beneath the village and the surrounding plateau. It is, by most accounts, one of the largest underground refuge networks ever discovered in northern France, and its story spans nearly 2 millennia of continuous, quietly recurring use. The earliest excavation is generally attributed to the Romans, who began quarrying the site for limestone sometime around the 2nd or 3rd century AD, extracting building material the same way countless Roman settlements did across the empire. But at Naours, something different happened after the quarrying stopped. Rather than being abandoned or filled in, the emptied chambers became something else entirely: a refuge. As waves of instability swept through the region across the centuries, Viking incursions in the 9th century, Norman conflicts, religious wars, and eventually the devastating 30 Years' War in the 17th century, local residents returned again and again to these tunnels, expanding them further with each generation, carving new galleries and chambers as need demanded. By the height of its use, Naours had become something closer to an actual settlement than a simple hiding place. Excavated chambers served as living quarters, storage rooms, and stables for livestock. 3 separate chapels were carved into the rock for worship. There were communal gathering spaces functioning almost like small underground town squares, and, perhaps most remarkably, a fully functional bakery, complete with working ovens, capable of feeding a population that, at its documented peak in the 1600s, may have reached roughly 3,000 people. That's nearly 3 times the population of the village above it today. An entire community, effectively invisible from the surface, capable of sustaining itself underground for extended periods whenever danger passed overhead. The practical ingenuity built into the tunnels only deepens on closer inspection. Visitors and researchers alike have documented deliberate defensive features: narrow choke points designed to slow intruders, concealed pit traps rigged with removable wooden boards that could be pulled away beneath an unsuspecting foot, and reportedly a network of children stationed as lookouts near entrances, trained to alert the adults below the moment strangers approached. The tunnel walls themselves, cut from a soft limestone interspersed with harder bands of flint, seem to have been worked with real awareness of the local geology, the flint layers likely helping stabilize the network's distinctively jagged ceilings, a structural detail that kept galleries from collapsing across centuries of use, foot traffic, and the added weight of everything built and stored within them. Eventually, as Europe stabilized in later centuries, the need for a hidden underground refuge faded, and Naours tunnels were closed off and largely forgotten, so thoroughly that by the time a local abbot named Danicourt rediscovered the network in 1887, apparently, after locals mentioned old stories of tunnels beneath the village, much of it had to be re-excavated and reopened before it could even be explored again. It's a striking detail in itself. An underground settlement large enough to house thousands of people, complete with chapels, bakeries, and defensive infrastructure, had simply slipped from active memory, hidden not by secrecy, but by the passage of time and the closing of a few key passages. What happened next adds an entirely different layer to the mystery. During the First World War, Naours sat just a few kilometers behind Allied lines, and thousands of soldiers, a large number of them Australian, visited the tunnels during periods of rest, many leaving their names, hometowns, and regimental details carved into the soft stone. Today, the site holds more than 3,000 pieces of documented graffiti from that war, believed to be the largest such collection anywhere on the former Western Front, a haunting, deeply personal record layered directly on top of centuries of medieval and Roman-era stonework. Then, remarkably, during the Second World War, German forces reportedly used sections of the same tunnel network as a radio control facility, occupying space that had once sheltered French villagers hiding from earlier invaders entirely. An irony the tunnels themselves make no comment on, simply absorbing one more chapter into their walls. Even now, with guided tours running through a portion of the network, visitors who've explored beyond the marked paths describe passages that seem to lead nowhere. Steep, unexplained tunnels branching off into darkness, and open chambers ending abruptly at unexplained drops or unexcavated rock faces. Details that suggest the fully mapped, tourist-accessible sections represent only a portion of what was actually carved beneath Naours over 2,000 years of intermittent construction. How much of the total network remains unexplored? What further chambers, defensive features, or forgotten uses might still lie in sections sealed off, collapsed, or simply never fully surveyed? Naours endured as a place people returned to, generation after generation, whenever the surface world became too dangerous to inhabit. Roman quarrymen, medieval villagers, Great War soldiers on leave, occupying German forces, each finding their own use for the same hollowed stone. What does it mean that an underground city could vanish so completely from memory? Not once, but potentially several times over its long history? And how many more names, chambers, or forgotten passages still wait in the sections of Naours that no flashlight has yet reached? Naours proved that an entire community could vanish into carved rock and resurface centuries later, remembered again almost by accident. Travel now to the arid Turpan Basin of far western China, to one of the lowest and hottest inhabited places on Earth, and you'll find a city built by an entirely different method, not carved downward into rock for concealment, but carved directly out of a raised plateau of solid earth, in full view, defended not by walls but by geography itself. The city is Jiaohe, and its setting is on its own almost enough to explain why it endured for as long as it did. Positioned roughly 10 kilometers west of the modern city of Turpan, in China's Xinjiang region, Jiaohe rises from a long, narrow plateau shaped, when viewed from above, like a willow leaf, nearly 1.5 miles long, but barely 300 meters wide at its broadest point. That plateau sits 30 meters above a river valley, and the river itself splits into two separate branches as it approaches the site, flowing around the plateau on both sides before rejoining further downstream. The Chinese name Jiaohe means, quite literally, where two rivers meet. It's a natural island, encircled by water and framed by sheer cliffs, and the people who built their capital here understood exactly what that terrain offered them. Because here is where Jiaohe's first real oddity emerges. Unlike almost every other major ancient city of comparable scale and significance, Jiaohe never needed walls. The 30-meter cliffs surrounding the plateau on three sides served as a defense more absolute than anything masons could have built, and the city's ancient inhabitants seem to have recognized this and built accordingly. Historical accounts describe only two gates granting access to the entire settlement, one in the southwest, one in the east. An extraordinarily small number of entry points for a city that, at its height in the 8th century, is estimated to have housed somewhere around 7,000 residents. Some researchers have identified possible traces of a third gate, but even accounting for that, Jiaohe's access points remain remarkably few for its size. Attackers approaching the city faced a stark choice: force their way through one of two narrow, easily defended gates, or attempt to scale sheer cliffs rising 30 meters above a river. Jiaohe was established as the capital of the Jushi Kingdom, sometime around the 2nd century BC, and it went on to serve, across many centuries and successive ruling powers, as a critical hub on the northern Silk Road, a fortified administrative center controlling trade and military movement through the Turpan Basin under the Han Dynasty, later the Tang Dynasty, and eventually the Uyghur Khaganate, before the city was gradually abandoned sometime in the 14th century. Its original inhabitants, the Jushi or Cheshi people, present their own puzzle worth pausing on. Archaeological remains recovered from tombs near the site, some dating back to around 300 BC, indicate these founding residents were of Indo-European, Tocharian descent, light-haired, blue-eyed people whose presence this deep in Central Asia, this early, continues to inform broader questions about ancient migration and cultural contact across the Silk Road long before it carried that name. What makes Jiaohe genuinely unique among ancient cities, though, isn't simply its defensive geography or its layered political history. It's the construction method itself. Jiaohe is widely considered the largest, oldest, and best preserved example of subtractive earthen architecture anywhere in the world, meaning that, rather than being built up from bricks or stone in the way nearly every other ancient city was, much of Jiaohe was carved directly downward and inward out of the solid Loess Plateau itself. Builders excavated the ground to leave standing walls of undisturbed earth in place, essentially sculpting entire buildings, streets, and compounds out of the raw material of the land, rather than assembling them from separate components. Some structures were then finished with rammed earth walls or dried mud brick added to the excavated framework. Others remained almost entirely subtractive, their rooms and passageways simply hollowed directly from the ground. This technique produced a city unlike almost anything else from the ancient world. The main avenue, stretching roughly 1.5 to 2 kilometers depending on measurement, runs from the southern gate northward through the heart of the settlement, dividing it into 3 distinct zones: a western residential district for common people, an eastern district reserved for aristocrats and troops, and a northern district devoted almost entirely to religious life, anchored by more than 50 documented Buddhist temple sites and, in its northernmost reaches, a grove of over 100 small stupas dating to as early as the 5th century. At the terminus of the main avenue stands the Great Buddhist Temple, its footprint spanning some 5,000 square meters, one of the largest and most intact structures on the site, its architecture reflecting the Tang Dynasty period during which much of Jiaohe's surviving construction was completed, But it's the residential architecture that raises some of the more genuinely puzzling questions about how the city actually functioned day to day. Walking through Jiaohe's residential quarters today, visitors and archaeologists alike note something distinctly unusual: the near-total absence of windows, even in structures whose walls still stand 6 meters high, and the fact that essentially no house doors face directly onto the streets. Instead, individual dwellings and family compounds were organized around internal walled courtyards, each with a single door that could be opened during the day and sealed at night. Anyone standing at street level, or even on a rooftop looking down, would have seen little but blank earthen walls. No windows to peer through, no doors to easily locate, no obvious way into any individual household without already knowing precisely where to look. It's a design that speaks unmistakably to defense and privacy prioritized over convenience or light. But it also raises a genuine question about daily life inside the city. How did residents navigate spaces built with concealment so deeply embedded into their architecture, layered on top of a settlement already defended by natural cliffs and a mere 2 gates? Climate adaptation adds another layer of engineering sophistication that continues to draw scholarly attention. Turpan sits in one of the most extreme environments in China. Summer temperatures regularly exceeding 50 degrees Celsius, winters dropping well below freezing, and annual rainfall so minimal it barely registers by comparison to almost anywhere else on Earth. Jiaohe's builders responded to this by placing many of the city's key structures, including certain government and administrative buildings, partially or entirely underground, leveraging the natural insulating properties of the surrounding Earth to maintain more stable interior temperatures across brutal seasonal extremes, staying cooler through the scorching summers and retaining warmth through the harsh winters. It's a passive climate control strategy that modern sustainable architecture continues to study and, in some cases, actively emulate, and yet it was implemented here well over 1,000 years ago, without any of the thermal modeling or material science that informs equivalent techniques today. Water presented its own persistent challenge. Despite being surrounded on 2 sides by flowing river branches, the plateau itself sat well above the water table, with no natural surface water or spring access anywhere on the raised islet. Archaeologists have documented well over 300 wells scattered throughout the site, a staggering number for a city of Jiaohe's size, implying a population that had to work continuously and collectively to secure enough water for daily life, agriculture, and the significant demands of a thriving religious and administrative center. How this dense a network of wells was planned, maintained, and shared across different districts of the city, each apparently governed by different social classes, different levels of access, different degrees of privilege, remains only partially reconstructed from what survives. Jiaohe's decline, when it eventually came, appears tied to a combination of factors: the disruption of trade routes following the collapse of Mongol Yuan authority in the region, prolonged warfare, and a shift toward a drier, colder climate associated with what's sometimes called the Little Ice Age, which likely strained the city's already precarious water supply beyond what its extensive well network could sustain. Archaeological evidence also points to a significant fire that swept through large sections of the city, with burned material found in numerous excavated structures. Though whether that fire was accidental, the result of conflict, or something else entirely remains a detail historians continue to debate rather than confirm. What's left today is a city frozen at the exact moment human habitation stopped. Walls still standing, streets still traceable, temple foundations still legible against the pale earth of the plateau, all of it slowly eroding under the same relentless sun and wind that the city's builders spent centuries learning to work around rather than fight. How much of Jiaohe's daily life, its social organization, Its internal water politics and the precise circumstances of its final abandonment remain locked in details too fragile or too fragmentary for archaeology to fully recover. And what does it mean that a civilization facing one of the harshest environments on the planet chose not to build up or to wall themselves in, but instead to carve their entire world directly out of the ground beneath their feet? Jiaohe's builders carved an entire city downward out of solid earth, defended by cliffs no army could easily scale. Return now to central Italy, to the Apennine highlands of Abruzzo, and you'll find a different strategy for the same problem. A fortified hilltop settlement where two civilizations, separated by centuries, each chose stone as their answer to the same relentless question of survival. The site is Alba Fucens, perched at over 1,000 meters elevation at the base of Monte Velino, overlooking what was once Lake Fucino before Roman engineers began the long process of draining it. Today, the ruins sprawl across a hillside with 3 distinct summits, all once enclosed within a single defensive perimeter, walls that, where they survive, still stretch for nearly 3 kilometers around the site, built from massive, irregularly shaped stone blocks fitted together in polygonal masonry, without mortar, in the same tradition that produced the walls of Alatri. And that comparison isn't accidental. This style of construction, sometimes called Cyclopean walling, named for the mythical one-eyed giants ancient Greeks and Romans believed alone possessed the strength to move stones of this size, appears across the Italian peninsula and beyond, and Alba Fucens holds one of its most extensive and best documented examples. The history embedded in these walls, though, runs deeper than the Roman colony most visitors come to see. Long before Rome ever laid claim to this ground, the site was already occupied and fortified by the Aequi, an Italic tribe that controlled this stretch of the central Apennines during the Iron Age, positioned along a contested frontier with their neighbors, the Marsi. Archaeological evidence indicates the Aequi established their hilltop settlement here as early as the 5th or 4th century BC, exploiting the same natural defensive advantages. Steep terrain, commanding views over the surrounding valleys, control of a critical mountain corridor that would later draw Roman attention to this exact location. Portions of the polygonal masonry found at Alba Fucens are attributed to this earlier, pre-Roman phase of construction, meaning that what visitors see today isn't a single unified defensive project, but layers of fortification built by 2 different peoples, separated by conquest, working the same stone with remarkably similar techniques. Rome's arrival changed the site's trajectory permanently. Following a series of campaigns against the Italic alliance, the Aequi among them, in the closing years of the 4th century BC, Rome established Alba Fucens as a Latin colony in 303 BC, settling roughly 6,000 colonists here to secure control over a strategically vital stretch of territory. The location mattered enormously. Alba Fucens commanded the Via Valeria, the road linking Rome directly to the Adriatic coast, making the colony a critical checkpoint for both military movement and trade. Over the centuries that followed, Alba Fucens grew into one of the most significant Roman settlements in central Italy, serving as a place where captured enemy kings were interned, including, according to historical accounts, Perseus, the last king of Macedonia, who died there after his defeat by Rome. The city remained loyal to Rome through crises including the Second Punic War against Hannibal and the later Social War, and it retained enough importance that the orator Cicero praised its steadfastness directly in his writings. What makes the walls themselves such a persistent point of fascination isn't simply their age or their scale, though both are considerable. It's the engineering logic built into their design. The main gateways, still identifiable today, with names like Massa, Felenica, and Massima marking the eastern, northern, and western entrances, weren't placed arbitrarily. Historical analysis of the site's fortifications reveals that these gates were deliberately positioned to expose the unprotected right side of any attacking force approaching the walls, a detail rooted in ancient battlefield practice. Soldiers typically carried shields on their left arm, leaving their right side more vulnerable, and Alba Fucens defenders engineered their approach routes specifically to funnel enemies into that exposed position before they could reach the gate itself. It's a level of tactical sophistication embedded directly into stonework, a defensive strategy calculated centuries in advance and then built permanently into the landscape. Beyond the primary gates, the walls also incorporate several so-called false doors, gateway-shaped features built into the polygonal masonry that lead nowhere, serving no functional passage at all. Their exact purpose remains genuinely debated. Some researchers propose they functioned as decoys, designed to confuse attackers about the true points of entry, forcing a besieging force to test multiple locations before finding a real way through. Others suggest a more ceremonial or symbolic function, tied to religious practice or civic identity rather than pure defense. Neither explanation has been definitively confirmed, and the false doors remain quite literally gateways to nothing. Deliberate architectural choices whose full reasoning has not survived alongside the stone itself. Beneath the surface, Alba Fucens holds another layer of engineering achievement that continues to draw specialist attention. The site's ancient sewage system, its Cloaca Maxima, was constructed using the same polygonal masonry technique found in the surface walls, a detail archaeologists and speleologists have noted as essentially unique within Italy, since underground infrastructure of this scale and technical consistency with above-ground fortification work is rarely documented elsewhere. First explored by the Irish archaeologist Edward Dodwell in the 19th century, this subterranean network remains, even now, an active subject of study, its full extent still not completely mapped. And in recent years, that ongoing exploration has produced a striking discovery: a previously unknown megalithic tunnel, its walls built with the same pristine polygonal masonry visible on the surface, uncovered only within the past several years and still under active investigation. What this tunnel connects, why it was built with such careful precision so far beneath the visible city, and what else might lie alongside it, undiscovered, remains an open question archaeologists are only beginning to answer. That question of what remains hidden takes on particular weight at Alba Fucens, because the excavated portion of the site, despite everything visible today, despite the walls, the forum, the amphitheater, the baths, the market center, and the sophisticated aqueduct and drainage systems already documented, represents by most estimates less than 10% of the total site. 90% or more of Alba Fucens remains unexcavated, still buried beneath centuries of accumulated soil and vegetation across the surrounding hillside. For a settlement this significant, occupied continuously for well over 1,000 years by two distinct civilizations, that's an extraordinary amount of unexplored ground, meaning that whatever the recently discovered megalithic tunnel represents may be only the first of many such finds still waiting beneath the surface. Alba Fucens' end came gradually, then abruptly. The city endured for more than 7 centuries as a loyal and strategically vital outpost of Rome, surviving political upheaval, foreign wars, and the empire's own internal crises. But a series of seismic events around the end of the 5th century AD caused severe damage, and the site's decline accelerated afterward, culminating in near-total destruction during Saracen raids in the 10th century. Survivors ultimately abandoned the hillside altogether, resettling in the nearby town of Massadelb, and Alba Fucens fell into the long, quiet obscurity that would preserve so much of it, undisturbed, until Belgian archaeologists began systematic excavation work in the mid-20th century. What's striking, standing among these walls today, is how directly they connect two very different building traditions: the Aequi's earlier fortifications, and Rome's later, more extensive construction, through the same essentially unchanged technique: massive, irregular stone, precisely fitted, entirely without mortar, strong enough to outlast both civilizations that raised it. Whether the Romans learned this method directly from the people they conquered, adapted it from a broader Italic tradition already established across the region, or arrived at similar solutions independently through similar defensive needs, remains a detail historians continue to untangle. The stones themselves offer no explicit answer. With 90% of Alba Fucens still unexcavated, and a genuinely new discovery already surfacing in the tunnels beneath the visible ruins, how much more of this layered 2,000-year story remains buried in the ground beneath Monte Velino? What other tunnels, false doors, or forgotten chambers might still be waiting for the next excavation season to bring them, finally, back into the light? Alba Fucens still holds 90% of its story beneath the Abruzzo hillside. Travel, now far to the east, into the Zarafshan Valley of northwestern Tajikistan, close to the border with Uzbekistan, and you'll find a settlement older than almost anything discussed so far in this exploration. A city whose name in the ancient Sogdian language means, quite simply, where the land begins. Sarazm sits on the left bank of the Zarafshan River, roughly 15 kilometers west of the modern city of Panjakent, in a landscape defined by two complementary resources: mountains to the south, rich in mineral ore and suited to pastoral herding, and fertile valley plains stretching outward, ideal for early agriculture and irrigation. It was this exact combination, the meeting point between nomadic mountain pastoralism and settled valley farming, that allowed a genuine proto-urban center to take root here, beginning as early as the 4th millennium BC. That places Sarazm's earliest occupation at roughly the same era as the first emerging civilizations of Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley, making it, by most accounts, the oldest known urban settlement anywhere in Central Asia. The discovery itself carries a quiet, almost accidental quality that seems fitting for a site whose name evokes origins. In 1970, a resident of a village near Panjakent found a small bronze axe adze while digging in a field. Rather than reporting the find immediately, he apparently waited 6 years before finally informing an archaeologist in Panjakent. When excavations began in earnest under Soviet archaeologist Abdulojon Isakov in 1976 and 1977, they revealed something far larger and more significant than anyone initially expected. A settlement that, at its peak, may have stretched across as much as 100 hectares, home to an estimated 3,000 people, sustained by farming, herding, and, increasingly as the centuries progressed, sophisticated metallurgy and craftsmanship. Archaeologists have identified at least 4 major phases of habitation at Sarazm, spanning from roughly the mid-4th millennium BC down to around 2000 BC, each phase revealing increasingly complex architecture. Excavated remains include dwellings, specialized workshops, structures believed to have served ritual or religious functions, granaries and storage facilities, and, in the settlement's later phases, what appear to be elite or palatial buildings, distinguished from surrounding residential structures by their scale and construction quality. The foundations of these buildings, many built from a combination of mud brick and stone, reveal a level of planning and specialization that surprised archaeologists working a region previously considered peripheral to the major cradle civilizations further west and south. What elevated Sarazm from a regional curiosity to a site of major international significance, though, wasn't simply its age. It was what the site revealed about the scale of trade connecting Central Asia to civilizations thousands of kilometers away, long before anything resembling the historical Silk Road existed in name. Excavated artifacts at Sarazm include lapis lazuli, sourced from Badakhshan, in what is now Afghanistan, turquoise from the Fergana Valley, carnelian and other semi-precious stones with origins tracing toward the Indus Valley and the Iranian Plateau, and evidence of contact, whether direct or through intermediary trade networks, extending as far as Mesopotamia and the shores of the Indian Ocean. Sarazm, in other words, wasn't an isolated agricultural outpost. It functioned as a genuine node in one of the earliest documented long-distance trade networks in human history. A proto-Silk Road connecting the mineral wealth of Central Asian mountains to the emerging urban civilizations, taking shape across the ancient Near East and South Asia. The most striking single discovery from the site, and the one that continues to draw researchers and visitors alike, is a burial that archaeologists came to call the Princess of Sarazm. Dated to roughly 3000 BC, the grave belonged to a woman in her mid-30s, found not in an isolated plot, but within an unusual architectural feature: a large stone ring, some 15 meters in diameter, constructed specifically to enclose the burial ground. Her body had been covered in a veil richly embroidered with an extraordinary number of beads. Researchers have counted more than 10,000 individual beads recovered from the grave, crafted from lapis lazuli, white limestone, turquoise, and jasper, with additional gold beads found near the head, apparently once threaded through her hair. A bronze mirror accompanied her burial as well. The sheer density and craftsmanship of these grave goods, combined with the deliberate architectural framing of the burial site itself, has led most researchers to conclude this was a woman of considerable status, though whether princess reflects an accurate title, a religious role, or simply a convenient modern label for someone whose actual position in Sarazm society remains undefined, is a distinction the evidence itself doesn't settle. That stone ring surrounding her grave is where Sarazm's architecture begins to raise questions extending beyond simple burial practice. Why enclose a single grave within a 15-meter circular stone structure when other burials at the site, some single, some paired, some collective, received comparatively modest treatment, occasionally accompanied by nothing more than a marble dish? Was the ring a marker of status alone, or did it carry additional ritual or cosmological significance, defining sacred space in a way that separated this particular burial from the rest of the community's dead? Archaeologists studying the broader layout of Sarazm have noted hearths and structures interpreted as altars scattered among the residential and workshop areas, suggesting ritual activity was woven directly into the fabric of daily life here rather than confined to separate temple structures. But the specific logic connecting architecture, status, and religious practice at Sarazm remains only partially reconstructed. The technical sophistication of Sarazm's material culture only deepens the picture. Excavators have documented evidence of established metallurgy, bronze, copper, silver, and gold objects, alongside tools and jewelry crafted with genuine skill, positioning Sarazm as what may have been the largest metallurgical center in Central Asia during this period. Pottery was produced using coiled clay strip construction, fired in dedicated clay stoves. A potter's wheel was recovered at the site as well, though evidence suggests it saw only limited use, with most vessels still shaped by hand well after the technology was available. Spindle, whorls, and bone tools point to established textile weaving and leather working traditions. Taken together, this is not the material record of a simple farming village slowly discovering trade. It's the record of a genuinely specialized, economically diverse, proto-urban society, operating with a level of craft sophistication that continues to complicate simpler narratives about how and where early urbanization first took hold across Eurasia. And yet, for all that has been recovered, much of Sarazm's full story remains stubbornly out of reach. The settlement appears to have gone into decline and was largely abandoned by the end of the 3rd millennium BC, roughly 1600 years after its earliest occupation began. And the reasons for that decline remain genuinely uncertain. Some researchers point toward shifting trade patterns, as emerging urban centers elsewhere in Central Asia and the broader region began to draw commerce away from Sarazm's particular geographic advantages. Others suggest environmental factors. Changes in the Zarafshan River's course or regional climate may have undermined the agricultural base that sustained the settlement for so long. No single explanation has been conclusively established, and much of Sarazm, most estimates suggest the majority of the 100-hectare site remains unexcavated, its structures either reburied under protective soil coverings or simply never yet opened to careful study, continues to hold whatever fuller record of the settlement's rise and eventual collapse still lies beneath the valley floor. What compelled a community, 5,500 years ago, to build such an elaborate stone-ringed monument around a single grave, adorning it with beads sourced from mountains hundreds of kilometers away? And how much more of Sarazm's layered history, its religious practices, its social hierarchy, the true circumstances of its slow abandonment, still waits beneath ground that archaeologists have only begun, cautiously, to disturb? Sarazm's stone-ringed grave still guards its questions in the Zarafshan Valley. Climb now into the Tian Shan Mountains of Kyrgyzstan to an altitude of over 3,000 meters, where a lone stone structure sits in a remote canyon so isolated that even reaching it today requires hours of travel over unpaved roads, and where the very purpose of the building itself remains, after more than a century of scholarly investigation, genuinely unresolved. The structure is Tash, whose name translates roughly as stone lodging or stone yard, set in the Karakoyun Gorge of the Atbashi district, along the banks of the small Tash River, just over 100 kilometers from the modern city of Naours, and not far from the Chinese border. At an elevation of roughly 3,200 meters, surrounded by rolling alpine terrain and grazing yak herds, the building sits in a landscape defined by extremes: brutal winters, thin air, and a silence broken mostly by wind. And yet, someone chose this exact punishing location to construct one of the most architecturally sophisticated stone buildings anywhere along the historical trade routes connecting Central Asia to China. The structure itself is almost perfectly square, built entirely from rubble stone set in clay mortar, with gypsum used to seal the joints between stones, a construction technique substantial enough to have survived largely intact for centuries, at an altitude where seismic activity, snow load, and temperature extremes routinely destroy less carefully built structures. Inside, the building contains roughly 30 rooms, most of them square in plan and topped with domed ceilings, each dome pierced by a small circular opening at its peak to admit light. The transition from square room to round dome achieved through a construction technique known as a squinch, a detail requiring genuine architectural sophistication to execute correctly. At the center of the complex sits a larger domed hall, its walls still bearing traces of gypsum plaster and faint remnants of paint, suggesting the space was once considerably more decorated than the bare stone visible today. Beneath the structure, a network of underground passages, hidden exits, and small chambers historically described as prison cells or hermit shelters extends further still, only partially explored even now. The mainstream historical account identifies Tash as a caravanserai, a fortified roadside inn built to shelter merchants, animals, and goods traveling the Silk Road routes connecting the Fergana Valley and Chu regions with Kashgar, on the far side of the mountains in what is now China. Most scholars date this phase of construction to the 15th century, and the building's location along a documented caravan route, combined with its layout of small individual rooms surrounding a larger central hall, fits reasonably well with the known caravanserai design found across Central Asia. Local oral tradition offers its own account, describing a Khan who commissioned the finest builders in his land to construct a stone lodging worthy of the caravans passing through his territory, one story claiming the structure endured for 1,000 years before internal betrayal and conflict brought its keepers down. But this explanation, tidy as it sounds, runs into a genuine architectural problem that scholars have wrestled with since serious study of the site began in the late 19th century. Caravanserais, almost without exception, were built around a central open courtyard, a space where merchants could unload pack animals, gather goods, and manage the practical business of travel. Tash Rabat has no courtyard at all. Its layout is instead fully enclosed, dense with small interconnected rooms arranged with a formality that feels less like an inn and more like something built for a very different purpose. This single missing feature has fueled more than a century of scholarly debate. As early as 1888, a Russian traveler proposed that the building had originally served as a Christian monastery, likely connected to the Church of the East, the so-called Nestorian tradition, which maintained a documented presence across parts of Central Asia during the medieval period. Research conducted by the Kyrgyz Academy of Sciences in the late 1970s and early 1980s reached a similar conclusion, dating an earlier phase of construction to the 10th century, and identifying the original structure as a Nestorian monastery, later repurposed and expanded into a caravanserai once Islam had become the region's dominant faith, and the building's religious function faded. That conclusion, though, comes with its own complication. Despite the strength of the architectural argument, no Christian artifacts, inscriptions, or religious objects have ever been recovered from excavations at the site. The monastery hypothesis rests almost entirely on structural logic, the absence of a courtyard, the layout's resemblance to religious rather than commercial architecture, rather than on any direct physical evidence of Christian worship having taken place here. It's a rare case where the strongest argument for a site's original purpose is built on what's missing from its design, rather than on what's actually been found within it. Whatever its original function, Tash Rabat's builders clearly understood how to construct a shelter capable of enduring one of the harshest environments accessible along the entire Silk Road network. The building sits on an artificial platform, its four sides oriented precisely toward the cardinal directions, its main portal facing east. At an elevation where snow can persist well into summer, and temperatures drop dramatically after sunset even in warmer months, the small domed rooms, the thick rubble stone walls, and the enclosed courtyard-less design may have served a genuinely practical purpose beyond religious symbolism, minimizing exposed surface area and retaining warmth far more effectively than an open caravanserai layout would allow. Whether this climate-adapted design was original to the structure's earliest monastic phase, or was refined later when Silk Road travelers took over the building and needed shelter from the same brutal winters, remains difficult to separate, given how thoroughly the site's two proposed identities are layered on top of each other. What role water played in the site's long survival here is a question that remains only thinly documented. The nearby Tash Rabat River would have offered an obvious source for drinking water and, seasonally, meltwater from the surrounding peaks. But no clearly identified system of channels, cisterns, or engineered water management has been confirmed through excavation at the site itself. Whether the building's occupants relied on simple proximity to the river, whether some undiscovered infrastructure once managed runoff or snowmelt around the structure's foundations, or whether the site's builders simply accepted the seasonal hardship of a 3,000-meter elevation as the unavoidable cost of controlling this strategic mountain pass, is a detail that current archaeology hasn't fully settled. Today, Tash Rabat remains one of the best preserved stone structures anywhere along the historic Silk Road. its underground passages still only partially explored, its domes still catching thin mountain light through openings cut by builders whose religious or commercial intentions still can't be fully separated from each other. Was this truly a monastery, repurposed by necessity into a way station for merchants crossing some of the most dangerous terrain in Central Asia? Or does the missing courtyard, the underground chambers, and the deliberate cardinal alignment point toward a purpose neither explanation has yet fully captured? And what, if anything, still lies unexcavated beneath the stone floors of a building that has kept its true origin story as tightly sealed as the gypsum mortar holding its walls together? Tash Rabat still guards its unresolved identity high in the Tian Shan Mountains. Travel now to the eastern coast of India, to a pair of low sandstone hills just south of the city of Bhubaneswar in Odisha, and the mystery shifts from a single isolated structure to something far more extensive. An entire hillside honeycombed with rock-cut chambers, carved not by later generations working from a blank plan, but by a single ambitious ruler who left behind, quite literally, his own account of what he built and why. The hills are called Udayagiri, meaning Sunrise Hill, and Kandagiri, its twin across a narrow valley, together forming what was once known as Kumari Parvata, a name preserved in one of the most significant inscriptions in early Indian history. Across these two hills, ancient builders carved a total of roughly 33 caves, 18 at Udayagiri and 15 at Kandagiri, most excavated during the reign of a single monarch, King Kharavela of the Mahameghavahana dynasty, who ruled the kingdom of Kalinga sometime around the 2nd to 1st century BC. These caves weren't temples in the conventional sense, nor were they tombs. They were built primarily as residential quarters for Jain ascetics, monks who had renounced worldly life and sought shelter suited to a philosophy built around simplicity, discipline, and withdrawal from material comfort. That context matters enormously for understanding what makes Udayagiri's rock-cut engineering genuinely remarkable. This wasn't a single cave, carved once and left alone. It was an entire complex, developed with clear architectural intention across multiple levels, connected by carved stairways, verandas, and internal passages that link individual cells into larger monastic structures. The most celebrated of these is Rani Gumpha, the Queen's Cave, a double-storied monastery whose upper level features an extended relief panel depicting what appears to be a royal procession or victory march, while individual cells throughout the structure are guarded by carved Dwarapala figures, sentinel sculptures positioned at entrances as though standing eternal watch over rooms that have stood empty for over 2,000 years. Achieving a stable, safely load-bearing two-story structure carved directly out of solid sandstone, rather than built up from separately quarried and stacked material, required builders to understand precisely how much rock could be removed from an upper level without compromising the structural integrity of everything beneath it. Miscalculate, and the entire carved mass above could collapse into the chambers below. That this didn't happen, that Rani Gumpha and several other multi-tiered caves at the site have survived structurally intact for well over 2 millennia, speaks to an engineering discipline that had to be essentially perfect on the first attempt. There was no scaffolding to correct a mistake once stone had already been subtracted from the hillside. The most historically significant single cave at the site, though, isn't architecturally the most elaborate. It's Hathi Gumpha, the Elephant Cave, named for carved elephant reliefs near its entrance, a large, relatively simple natural cavern on the southern face of Udayagiri Hill. What elevates Hathi Gumpha above every other chamber at the site is what's carved into the overhanging rock brow above its opening, a 17-line inscription cut in deep Brahmi script, recording the achievements and reign of King Kharavela himself. This inscription stands as one of the most important primary sources for understanding post-Mauryan history in eastern India, describing not only Kharavela's military campaigns, but his civic works, the rebuilding of his capital's walls after cyclone damage, the enlargement of an irrigation canal originally dug 3 centuries earlier, and, critically, the excavation of these very caves for Jain ascetics during the 13th year of his rule. It's a rare and valuable thing in archaeology. A monument whose builder essentially left behind his own annotated construction record, carved permanently into the stone above the very work he was describing. And yet, even with that inscription in hand, significant portions of Udayagiri's full history remain frustratingly unresolved. The Hati Gomfa inscription itself has proven difficult to fully interpret. Weathering across more than 2,000 years has defaced and blurred substantial sections of the text, and early British scholars in the 19th century misread key passages entirely, producing interpretations that took over a century of subsequent scholarship to correct. Even today, some portions of the 17 lines remain genuinely ambiguous, with scholars continuing to debate the precise sequence and significance of certain events Kharavela describes. A monument built specifically to record its own history has, ironically, become itself a subject of ongoing decipherment and disagreement. There's also the question of scale. According to one reading of a damaged section of the Hathigumfa inscription itself, Kharavela may have excavated as many as 117 caves across Kumari Parvata during his reign, a number far exceeding what survives today. Modern surveys have counted considerably fewer intact caves across both hills. Estimates from early 20th century archaeologists ranged from roughly 24 to just over 30 structures still identifiable. If the inscription's figure is accurate, then a substantial number of Kharavela's original excavations have simply vanished, collapsed, eroded away, or buried beneath centuries of soil and vegetation, their existence preserved only in a single, partially damaged line of text. What remains of those lost caves, if anything does remain, is a question current archaeology hasn't definitively answered. The site's religious layering adds another dimension of complexity. While Udayagiri and Khandagiri are overwhelmingly associated with Jain monastic use, and Kharavela's own inscription frames his patronage explicitly in Jain religious terms, rock-cutting activity at the hills didn't stop with his reign. Excavation and carving continued for centuries afterward, extending into the medieval period under the Somavamshi dynasty, as late as the 10th or 11th century AD, meaning caves at the site reflect not a single moment of construction, but well over a millennium of intermittent religious use, expansion, and reinterpretation. Some later additions, like a carving of Ganesha added to one cave's interior, clearly postdate the original excavation by centuries, layered onto structures whose initial purpose had nothing to do with the deities later worshipped within them. Untangling exactly which features belong to Kharavela's original 2nd century BC program, and which represent later modification by subsequent generations working within already hollowed stone, remains an ongoing challenge for archaeologists studying the site's full chronology cave by cave. Perhaps the most genuinely puzzling detail, though, is one buried within the inscription's own damaged text, a reference, still only partially understood, to a structure Kharavela is said to have erected near the monastic retreats, built, according to the inscription, at enormous cost, using hundreds of stones gathered from different quarries, with pillars reportedly containing a core of cat's eye gemstone. No structure matching this precise description has been definitively identified among the surviving remains at Udayagiri. Was this an elaborate freestanding monument that has since been lost entirely to time, its foundation stones scattered or reused in later construction? Was it somehow incorporated into one of the existing caves in a form not yet recognized for what it originally was? Or does the inscription describe something never fully completed, interrupted by later political upheaval following Kharavela's reign? The text hints at something extraordinary, gathered from multiple quarries at what the inscription itself calls enormous expense, and then falls silent on precisely where that extraordinary thing now stands, or whether it stands at all. Excavation and epigraphic study at Udayagiri continue even now, more than a century after serious archaeological attention first turned to the site. Each careful rereading of the Hathigumpha inscription's weathered lines offers the possibility of recovering details lost to earlier misinterpretation. Each survey of the surrounding hillside carries the faint possibility of locating traces of caves long since collapsed or buried beneath accumulated soil. What was Kharavela's true program for these twin hills? A modest monastic retreat, or something considerably more ambitious, only a fraction of which survives to be seen today? And somewhere within the eroded, gem-flecked reference to a lost structure built from stones gathered across many quarries, is there still a physical trace waiting to be found, connecting Udayagiri's carved chambers to an ambition the surviving caves alone don't fully reveal? Udayagiri's carved hillside still keeps at least one lost structure unaccounted for. Return now to the cloud forests of northern Peru, back to the fortified ridge of Kuélap, but this time, look past the roundhouses and the carved friezes visitors usually photograph, and turn attention instead to what lies beneath the city itself, the platform it stands on, and the extraordinary feat of engineering required to level a mountain ridge before a single roundhouse could ever be built. Kuélap sits atop a narrow limestone ridge in the Amazonas region, at roughly 3,000 meters elevation, overlooking the Utcubamba Valley. Anyone who has walked a real mountain ridge knows the obvious problem this presents. Ridgelines aren't flat. They curve, slope, and fall away unevenly on either side, shaped by millions of years of erosion rather than by any human design. And yet Kuélap, when you stand inside its walls today, offers a surface that feels remarkably level. An extended, walkable urban platform stretching nearly 600 meters in length, capable of supporting over 400 circular stone structures, temples, plazas, and residential compounds, all arranged as though the ground beneath them had simply always been this accommodating. It hadn't. What Kuélap's builders actually accomplished was something closer to architectural sculpture on a massive scale, transforming an irregular, sloping ridge into a stable, artificially leveled platform, using construction techniques that required real structural insight into how weight, fill, and facing stone interact under enormous and sustained pressure. Archaeological documentation of the site describes the great outer wall not simply as a defensive perimeter in the way city walls are typically imagined, but as the external face of an entire monumental platform, a structure containing a colossal, solid construction fill of stacked blocks or stone columns bound with clay mortar, faced on the exterior with a carefully laid veneer of dressed limestone blocks arranged in regular horizontal courses. In effect, the wall wasn't built to enclose a flat space that already existed. It was built to create that flat space, holding an enormous mass of packed fill in place against the mountain's natural slope, leveling the rugged terrain into the foundation the Chachapoya needed before construction of the city itself could even begin. This is a genuinely different engineering challenge than simply stacking stone to build height. A retaining structure of this scale has to withstand continuous outward pressure from the material it holds back. Not a momentary load, but a persistent, unrelenting force pushing against the wall every single day, for as long as the wall stands. Add to that the weight of everything eventually built on top of the leveled platform, over 400 structures, their foundations, their inhabitants, centuries of accumulated activity, and the wall's engineers needed to calculate not just how to build upward, but how to build outward and downward simultaneously, distributing enormous compressive forces through a structure with no steel reinforcement, no modern concrete, nothing beyond stone, clay mortar, and a precise understanding of how mass, friction, and gravity interact. Sections of this platform wall still reach heights of 20 meters today, and where it survives intact, it continues doing exactly the job it was built for, holding an artificially flattened mountaintop in place more than 1,000 years after the last stone was set. The platform itself isn't a single uniform surface either. Kuélap is organized into distinct upper and lower sectors, each built on its own leveled terrace, separated by additional internal walls that further subdivide and support the site's uneven natural topography. The northern portion of the site sits on its own terraced base, apparently reserved for structures with thicker walls and more restricted access, likely elite residences or administrative spaces set apart from the general population below. This layered terracing means Kuélap's builders weren't solving one leveling problem, but several, nested within each other, each terrace requiring its own calculation of fill, facing, and load distribution to remain stable relative to the terraces above and below it. Woven into this same platform structure, researchers have also documented an integrated system of stone-cut drainage channels, designed specifically to manage rainfall runoff and prevent erosion within the walled compound. This detail matters enormously for understanding just how deliberately engineered the entire site actually was. A cloud forest environment at 3,000 meters receives significant sustained rainfall, and an artificially constructed platform built from packed fill and mortared stone is exactly the kind of structure water erosion could gradually destroy from the inside, given enough time and enough uncontrolled runoff. By integrating drainage directly into the platform's design from the outset, Kuélap's builders weren't simply solving the immediate problem of creating flat, usable ground. They were solving for the platform's long-term survival against the very climate that made this cloud forest ridge worth fortifying in the first place. What continues to draw scholarly attention, though, is the sheer scale of labor and planning this entire undertaking required, especially given current estimates of Kuélap's construction timeline. Evidence of early occupation on the ridge dates back centuries before the site's major expansion, but the bulk of the massive walls, platforms, and circular structures visible today are generally attributed to an intensive building phase between roughly 900 and 1100 AD, during which the Chachapoya appear to have committed enormous, coordinated communal labor to transforming the ridge into the citadel that survives now. Constructing a platform of this scale, leveling an entire mountaintop, essentially stone by mortared stone, implies a level of centralized planning, sustained labor organization, and structural knowledge passed down with real consistency across however many builders and however many years the project ultimately required. And yet, much like so many sites explored in this investigation, the Chachapoya left behind no written engineering record explaining precisely how that knowledge was developed, tested, or transmitted. What survives is only the platform itself, still holding its shape against gravity and centuries of mountain rainfall. Some researchers studying Chachapoya construction techniques have even proposed connections extending well beyond Kuélap itself, suggesting that similar engineering principles, and possibly even Chachapoya laborers directly, may have influenced monumental terracing at other major Andean sites much further south, incorporated later into Inca construction projects during the period of imperial expansion. Whether that specific claim holds up to further scrutiny remains a matter of ongoing academic discussion rather than settled fact. But even setting aside those broader claims, Kuélap's own platform stands as a striking testament on its own terms. proof that an isolated highland society, working at extreme elevation, in one of the wettest and most geologically challenging environments in the Andes, achieved a level of structural engineering sophisticated enough to reshape a mountain ridge itself into stable, livable ground. How many more layers of fill, drainage, and internal terracing remain unexamined beneath the visible surface of Kuélap? And what does it say about a civilization that its first true act of city building wasn't raising walls or roofs at all, but reshaping the mountain itself into something flat enough to build upon? Kuélap's engineers reshaped an entire mountain ridge just to build on level ground. Descend now to the plains of northern India, to the banks of the Ganges near modern Prayagraj, where a different kind of ancient engineering achievement lay buried and forgotten for nearly 2,000 years. Not a platform built to raise a city above the earth, but a system built to tame one of the most powerful rivers on the subcontinent. The site is Sringavarapura, a name that appears in the Valmiki Ramayana itself, describing a settlement on the banks of the Ganges where the exiled Prince Rama is said to have crossed the river with the help of a boatman named Guha. For centuries, that reference existed only as literary tradition, until archaeological excavation, carried out between 1977 and 1986 under the direction of the noted Indian archaeologist B.B. Lal, working in collaboration with the Archaeological Survey of India, uncovered something that transformed Sringavarapura from a name in an epic poem into a documented, physically verifiable achievement of ancient hydraulic engineering. What Lal's team found, buried beneath centuries of accumulated soil, was a reservoir complex of genuinely staggering ambition. A tank system stretching some 250 meters in length, constructed of fired brick, dating to the early historic period of Indian civilization, roughly 2,000 years old. This wasn't a simple pit dug to collect rainwater. It was a carefully engineered multi-stage system designed to intercept floodwater from the monsoon-swollen Ganges itself, filter and clean that water through a sequence of connected chambers, and store the result for sustained use by the settlement above, all while managing the very real danger that a river as powerful as the Ganges posed to any structure built too close to its banks. The system began with an intake canal, roughly 11 meters wide and 5 meters deep, engineered specifically to skim floodwater off the swollen river during the monsoon season, drawing it away from the main channel and into the built system before it could simply overwhelm the surrounding land. That water first entered what excavators identified as a silting chamber, a dedicated space where suspended sediment carried by the flood could settle out of the water before it moved any further into the system. This is, in itself, a piece of applied fluid engineering that modern water treatment facilities still rely on. Slow the water down, give particulate matter time and space to fall out of suspension, and only then move the relatively cleaner water forward to the next stage. Ancient engineers at Sringavarapura appear to have understood this principle well enough to build an entire dedicated structure around it, 2 millennia before anyone would formalize it as sedimentation theory. From the silting chamber, water flowed into a brick-lined tank, identified in excavation reports simply as Tank A, which functioned as an initial storage and further settling stage. From there, water passed through a carefully constructed stepped inlet into a second tank, Tank B, and that stepped transition wasn't incidental. Water, moving through a graduated series of steps, loses velocity and further sheds remaining sediment with each drop, meaning the inlet itself functioned as an additional filtration stage, cleaning the water even further before it reached what excavators identified as the system's primary water supply reservoir. From Tank B, water moved onward into a third structure, a circular tank designated Tank C, distinguished by an elaborate built staircase descending into the water. a design allowing controlled access to the reservoir at varying water levels, presumably as the tank filled and emptied across different points in the seasonal flood cycle. Perhaps the most sophisticated element of the entire complex, though, is what excavators found governing the system's overflow: an elaborate waste weir consisting of 7 separate spill channels, a defined crest structure, and a final controlled exit point, all engineered specifically to return excess water safely back into the Ganges once the reservoir's capacity had been reached. This detail matters enormously for understanding the scale of thinking behind the entire project. Any engineer building a large reservoir fed directly by a flooding river faces an unavoidable problem. What happens when the incoming water exceeds what the system can safely hold? Get that calculation wrong, and the entire structure risks catastrophic failure. The accumulated pressure of floodwater breaching walls never designed to contain it. Sringavarapura's builders didn't leave that question to chance. They engineered a deliberate, multi-channel release valve directly into the system's architecture, ensuring controlled overflow rather than uncontrolled collapse. By most estimates, the completed reservoir held a capacity of roughly 2 million liters of water, and researchers studying the site have suggested it may well have been the largest reservoir of its kind anywhere in the world at the time of its construction. That's a claim worth sitting with for a moment. This wasn't simply an impressive regional achievement. If the dating and comparative analysis hold, Sringavarapura's builders created, on the banks of the Ganges, roughly 2,000 years ago, one of the most technically sophisticated large-scale water management systems that existed anywhere on Earth during that period, combining flood control, water filtration, and long-term storage into a single integrated engineering solution, built entirely from fired brick and a precise understanding of how moving water behaves under pressure, gradient, and volume. Archaeological work at the site also places Sringavarapura's occupation considerably earlier than the reservoir itself, with evidence of ochre-colored pottery, a distinctive early ceramic tradition, dating the settlement's presence back to at least the 11th century BC, meaning the site was inhabited for well over 1,000 years before this particular hydraulic system was engineered and built. That long occupation history raises its own set of questions that current archaeology hasn't fully resolved. What prompted the specific decision, at whatever point in the site's early historic period this reservoir was constructed, to invest such extraordinary resources into taming the Ganges' seasonal floods rather than simply relocating settlement further from the riverbank, as many other ancient communities facing similar flood risk chose to do? Was this driven by pure practical necessity, a growing population that had outgrown simpler water sources and needed guaranteed, filtered supply regardless of season? Or did the site's connection to the Ramayana narrative itself, whether as genuine historical memory or as a location that had already accumulated religious significance by the time of construction, motivate an investment in infrastructure disproportionate to what a purely practical calculation might have justified? There's also the broader question of transmission and comparison. Researchers examining Sringavarapura's engineering have drawn direct comparisons to water conservation systems documented at other major early Indian urban sites, including the much older Indus Valley city of Dholavira, whose cascading reservoir network was explored earlier in this investigation. Both systems reflect a shared underlying philosophy: capturing seasonal water at scale, managing its flow through carefully graduated stages, and storing it against the certainty of drier months ahead. Whether Sringavarapura's builders drew directly on engineering traditions inherited from earlier Indus-era water management, or arrived at strikingly similar solutions independently, separated by well over 1,000 years and a considerable geographic distance, is a question that current archaeological evidence doesn't yet definitively answer. What's clear is that this wasn't an isolated technical anomaly. It reflects, instead, a sustained and evidently long-lived tradition of sophisticated water engineering across the Indian subcontinent, one whose full continuity and inheritance across so many centuries and so many separate civilizations still isn't completely mapped. Much of Sringavarapura's original built environment beyond the reservoir itself remains only partially excavated, and the settlement's own transition from an early historic town into whatever role it may have played in the epic tradition that preserved its name continues to be examined by researchers working the site. What compelled a community here to engineer, with such precision, a system capable of taming one of the world's most powerful rivers, 2,000 years before anything resembling modern hydraulic science existed? And how much more of the technical knowledge that made this reservoir possible, knowledge apparently sophisticated enough to be called, by some who've studied it, without exaggeration, an engineering marvel of its era, has simply been lost between the silting chamber's ancient sediment and the modern soil that buried it for nearly 2 millennia?